Wyatt Blackthorn's hand came down on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled against their saucers. "I don't care what she's done for this house," he said, his voice low and final, the kind of low that meant there was no room left for argument. "She's leaving by Friday." Across the room, his daughter Rose stood frozen in the doorway, 8 years old and holding a wildflower she'd picked that morning to give to Evelyn. The flower trembled in her small fist. Nobody asked the little girl what she thought. Nobody ever did. And Evelyn Hartwell, standing at the kitchen basin with her back straight and her hands still wet from washing the breakfast dishes, did not turn around. She had learned a long time ago that when a powerful man decided something, the turning around only made it worse. She simply reached for the towel and dried her hands, one finger at a time. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who never took the time to truly see you, if you've ever walked away from a place that needed you more than it knew, then you already understand what Evelyn felt in that moment. Stay with this story. If this is your first time here, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The wagon that carried Evelyn Hartwell into the Blackthorn property rolled in just after 9 in the morning, when the August heat was already settling over the land like a second skin. She had the window seat, which sounds more comfortable than it was. The bench was cracked. The canvas above her head had a long split that let in a blade of white sun, and it hit her directly in the eyes the entire last hour of the ride. She didn't complain. She'd stopped complaining about small discomfort somewhere around the time her husband died and left her with $43, a house with a leaking roof, and a burial to arrange. That was 4 years ago. She had managed. She pressed the leather bag against her side. It was the only bag she'd brought, old and soft and shaped by years of carrying things that didn't quite fit, and she looked out at what she could see of the land as the wagon curved through the front gate of the Blackthorn estate. The gate alone told her everything she needed to know about the man she was coming to work for. It was iron, black, taller than most men by a full foot, and above the arch, the name Blackthorn had been forged into the metal in letters thick enough to cast their own shadows. It was a gate built not just to keep things in or out, but to remind anyone passing through exactly who owned what lay beyond it. She had read the advertisement 3 times before responding to it. Household manager sought for large private estate. Widowed or unmarried woman preferred. Experience with cooking, organization, and child management required. Wages discussed upon arrival. The wage discussion part had given her pause. It meant they hadn't decided yet. It meant they were going to look at her first and then decide what she was worth. She had responded anyway. The $43 were long gone. The house came into view as the wagon rounded a line of old cottonwood trees, and she let herself look at it fully for a moment. It was large. That was the first word. Large in the way that reminded you this man had not inherited wealth. He had accumulated it, piece by piece, until the accumulation itself became a kind of statement. 3 stories, a wide front porch that ran the entire length of the face, 6 windows across the top floor with the curtains drawn even in morning. Prosperous, deliberate, cold. She noticed the cold first. The wagon stopped at the side entrance, not the front. The driver, a quiet older man named Curtis, who hadn't said more than 12 words to her during the entire ride from town, climbed down and offered her a hand she didn't particularly need, but accepted anyway because it was the polite thing to do. "Mr. Blackthorn will see you in the side yard," Curtis said. She didn't ask why not inside. She picked up her bag and followed him around the corner. Wyatt Blackthorn was standing near the fence line, talking to 2 of his men. He didn't look up immediately when they approached. He finished what he was saying, something about a section of the north pasture fence and whether it needed replacing before the fall drive. And then he handed a piece of paper to one of the men and turned. He was taller than she expected. Not dramatically so, but taller, with the particular kind of posture that comes from years of being the person other people wait on, the person whose attention everyone is trying to get. His hat was dark and had seen real weather. His boots were the boots of a man who actually worked, not the polished vanity boots of someone playing at ranching. She noted all of this in the time it took him to cover the distance between them. He looked at her the way she expected him to look at her. His eyes moved from her face to her bag to her shoes and back to her face, and she watched him arrive at his conclusions the way you watch a man count out coins, quickly, efficiently, and with a finality that doesn't invite discussion. She had worn her best dress. It was clean. It was pressed as well as she'd been able to manage at the boarding house the night before. But it was also old, and the fabric had a particular quality that old fabric gets when it has been washed many times. Thin at the elbows, faded at the cuffs. She was aware of all of it. She had been aware of it since she buttoned the last button that morning. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. Not a question, a confirmation that she was indeed the person he'd been informed to expect. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said. There was a pause. I was waiting for something, perhaps for her to seem more impressive, or perhaps simply to organize whatever he was thinking into something he could say out loud. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said. It wasn't cruel. It was just honest, and she understood the honesty for what it was. A man who had not yet learned that honesty without tact is only half a virtue. "Most people are," she said. He blinked. The two ranch hands behind him exchanged a glance. He asked her to follow him inside, and she did. "Rose won't touch anything that smells like vinegar. Other than that, they're not particular." She filed this away. "And you?" He seemed faintly surprised to be included in the question. "I'm not difficult." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that the most difficult people are always the ones who describe themselves as not difficult. She just nodded. He showed her the rest of the house in the abbreviated way of a man who considers the tour a formality. The dining room. The library. 2 walls of books, several of which had never been opened. She could tell by the spines. The upstairs hallway with its 4 closed doors, including the children's rooms and one at the far end that he did not name or explain, and which she understood immediately was not to be discussed. His wife's room, she guessed. Left closed. Left alone. He showed her the small bedroom off the kitchen that would be hers. It was plain and clean and had a window that looked out over the back of the property, past the kitchen garden, or what had been a kitchen garden once. Now it was mostly weeds and 3 stubborn tomato plants that had survived out of pure determination. "This is acceptable," she said. "Good," he said. He crossed his arms. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Hartwell. I had a different picture in mind when I placed the advertisement." "I know," she said. That surprised him again. He seemed like a man who was not often surprised, and who wasn't sure whether he liked it. "The last woman who came out from Clearwater couldn't manage 2 weeks," he said. "The one before that left after the first day. This is a working ranch. The hours are long, the work isn't gentle, and my children are not easy at the moment." "I wouldn't expect them to be," she said. "They lost their mother." He went very still, just for a second. The way water goes still right before something disturbs the surface. "Yes," he said. They did. She waited to see if he would say anything else. He didn't. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed and as long as I'm treated fairly," she said. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for honest." He studied her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not approval exactly, but not dismissal either. Something in between. "Wages," he said. Margaret was paid $12 a month plus room and board. It was a reasonable wage and they both knew it. "That'll be fine," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked out of the room, and Evelyn stood alone in her small plain bedroom and looked out the window at the neglected garden and thought, "Well, here we are." She met the children at supper. She had spent the afternoon learning the kitchen, where everything was, what was well stocked, what was missing, what had been allowed to go to waste in Margaret's absence. There was good flour and no decent salt pork. There were 4 jars of preserved peaches on a high shelf and an entire sack of dried beans that had been there long enough to have lost some of their color. She made a mental list and said nothing to anyone about it. For supper, she made a simple beef stew. There was fresh meat at least, a good cut left by the butcher 2 days prior, with cornbread baked in the cast iron she found hanging nearest the stove. Nothing elaborate. She was not trying to impress anyone on the first evening. She was trying to make something hot and nourishing that a working man and 2 grieving children might actually eat. Ethan came to the table first. He was tall for 11, with his father's posture already starting to settle into his frame, and he looked at the bowl she set in front of him with the particular wariness of a child who has been disappointed by too many changes in too short a time. "What happened to Margaret?" he asked. Her mother is sick, Evelyn said. She needed to go home and take care of her. People always leave, he said. Not dramatically. Just as a statement of fact, the way a child states facts when they have accepted something painful as simply the way things are. She didn't try to argue with him or reassure him. She set the cornbread on the table and said, "The stew's hot. You should eat it while it is." He looked at her for a moment, then picked up his spoon. Rose arrived 2 minutes later, barefoot, which suggested she had been somewhere she wasn't supposed to be and had removed her shoes at some point during the adventure. She climbed into her chair and pulled the bowl toward her and smelled it before anything else, which Evelyn thought was an entirely reasonable thing to do. "No vinegar?" Rose asked. "No vinegar," Evelyn confirmed. Rose ate. Wyatt came in last, having washed his hands and changed his shirt. She noticed the change, a clean work shirt, nothing fancy, but clean, and he sat at the head of the table and ate without ceremony. He did not compliment the food. He did not complain about it. He ate it, which she decided was the most honest review a person can give. After supper, when the children had been sent upstairs, he remained at the table with his coffee, and she began clearing the dishes. She was not trying to make any particular impression. She was simply doing what needed to be done. "Cornbread was good," he said to his coffee cup. She paused in her clearing. "Thank you." "Margaret used to burn it on the bottom," he said. "Every time." "Cast iron needs watching," she said. She never quite figured that out. There was almost something human in his voice saying this. Almost. She finished clearing and went to her room, and that was the first day. The second and third days were harder. Ethan, she learned, was not simply quiet, he was strategic. He'd had 2 years to perfect the art of being present without being reachable, of answering questions in ways that gave away nothing and required nothing back. He was polite, technically. He did what was asked of him. But he had built a wall around himself with the patience and precision of a much older person, and he maintained it with a vigilance that made her chest ache. She didn't push. She had learned the hard way that pushing a closed door makes a person press harder against it from the other side. Rose was different, louder in her grief, which actually made it easier to see. She had her mother's things in her room, Evelyn discovered when she went to collect the laundry. A small hairbrush, a handkerchief with embroidered edges, a tin locket that Rose wore around her neck and touched constantly, the way a person touches a wound to remind themselves it's still there. On the third morning, Rose came to the kitchen while Evelyn was kneading bread dough and stood in the doorway watching. "What are you making?" Rose asked. "Bread," Evelyn said. "You want to help?" Rose considered this with the seriousness of a child evaluating a significant proposition. Then she crossed the kitchen and climbed onto the step stool near the work table and looked at the dough. "Mama made bread," she said. "Did she?" Evelyn said. Not a question, just acknowledgement. "She made it on Sundays," Rose said. "She'd let me push it." She looked at the dough. "She'd put flour on my nose. I didn't like it, but I pretended I did." Evelyn turned a portion of the dough toward the girl. "You can push this part," she said. Rose pressed her small palms into the dough with more force than you'd expect from a child that size. "You're not going to put flour on my nose," Rose said. It wasn't a question. It was more of a boundary. "I wasn't planning on it," Evelyn said. "Okay," Rose said, and she kept pressing the dough. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that doesn't show up in any ledger or record, that no one observes or praises. But in the economy of a broken household, small things are the only currency that actually matters, and Evelyn had always understood this better than most. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the larder, repaired the hinge on the kitchen door that had been squeaking for what appeared to be months based on the groove it had worn into the floor, started clearing the kitchen garden of its worst weeds in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, and established a rhythm of meals that was simple, consistent, and warm in the way that consistency itself creates warmth. The ranch hands ate separately in the bunkhouse, but several of them came to the kitchen door on various pretexts. A question about supper time, a request for a cloth to wrap a cut. And she treated each of them as she would treat anyone, directly, without fuss, without either excessive warmth or deliberate coldness. Word traveled in small communities the way it always does, and by the end of the week she was aware that her presence in the household had been discussed around the bunkhouse fire. She was aware of it because a man named Holt, the foreman, stopped her near the garden on the 6th morning and said, "You're doing all right, Mrs. Hartwell," in the tone of a man who doesn't compliment easily and knows it. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said. "Wyatt's not an easy man," he said. "I've noticed," she said. "He's better than he seems," Holt said. Then he seemed to reconsider saying it. "Just so you know." She thought about this. She had seen glimpses of what Holt meant, the way Wyatt paused sometimes near the children's doorway in the evening without going in, the way he kept a particular cracked coffee mug on the shelf above all the others and never used it, but also never put it away. Small evidence of a man who cared about things and didn't know what to do with the caring. "I expect he is," she said. Holt nodded and went back to his work. It was on the 8th day that the first real fracture appeared. Wyatt had come back from the eastern section of the property in a foul mood, something to do with a boundary dispute she gathered from the fragments she overheard, and he walked through the kitchen while she was in the middle of making supper, which she did not consider remarkable, and stopped when he saw Rose sitting on the floor near the fireplace with a small pile of dried beans she'd sorted from the sack. Rose had taken it upon herself, without being asked, to sort the beans into good and not good piles, a task she'd watched Evelyn do the day before. She was doing it with total concentration, holding each bean up towards the firelight and examining it the way a jeweler examines a stone. "What is she doing?" Wyatt said. It wasn't addressed to Rose, it was addressed to Evelyn, as if Rose were a phenomenon that required explanation. "Helping with supper," Evelyn said, without looking up from the pot. "She's sitting on the floor," he said. "That's where the beans are," Evelyn said. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Rose looked up at him, and then looked back at her beans and didn't say anything, and there was something in that, in the practiced, careful way she didn't say anything, that made Evelyn's hands tighten slightly on the ladle she was holding. "Rose," Wyatt said, "go wash up for supper." "I'm helping," Rose said. "You've helped enough," he said. "Go on." Rose gathered her piles. She took both piles, the good and the not good, cradling them in her small hands. And she crossed to the work table and set them down carefully so as not to lose her sorting work. And then she went out of the kitchen. Wyatt watched her go. Then he turned to Evelyn. "She shouldn't be on the floor," he said. "She was perfectly happy," Evelyn said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" she asked. She said it calmly. She was not trying to start a fight. She genuinely wanted to understand. He didn't answer immediately. He stood in the kitchen in his dust-covered coat and his bad mood, and she could see him sorting through possible responses and discarding them one by one. "She's been spending too much time in the kitchen," he said, finally. "She comes on her own," Evelyn said. "I know she comes on her own," he said, and something shifted in his voice. Not anger exactly, but something raw underneath it. "That's what I mean." She understood then. He wasn't objecting to the floor or the kitchen. He was objecting to the attachment, to the fact that his daughter was finding comfort somewhere he hadn't offered it and couldn't seem to provide. She said nothing to this because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. He left the kitchen, and she finished supper, and when Rose came back to the table she had flour on her cuffs, which meant she had detoured to the kitchen work table again on her way to wash up, which meant she had finished sorting the beans before she went. Evelyn served supper and said nothing about the flour. Rose ate the whole bowl. What? The second week brought harder weather and harder truths. A section of the north fence did need replacing, which meant the men were out longer and came back exhausted and short-tempered, and the household absorbed that tension the way households do, in the silences that stretched longer than they should, in the evenings that settled into the rooms like something with weight to it. Ethan, who had been maintaining his careful distance, cracked on a Wednesday. He came to the kitchen in the late afternoon when the house was quiet. His father still out on the property, Rose having her reading lesson with the school books Wyatt insisted she work through each afternoon. And he stood at the kitchen door with the look of someone who has been working up to something for longer than is comfortable. Evelyn was mending one of Rose's aprons. She had found it stuffed behind the washboard with a tear in the pocket she guessed had been there for weeks. "Do you know how to play checkers?" Ethan asked. She looked up. "I do," she said. "Papa never has time," he said. She set down the apron. "Is there a board?" "In the library," he said. They played for 40 minutes at the kitchen table because the library felt too formal for what this actually was. He beat her the first game through a combination of genuine strategic thinking and the advantage of her deliberate carelessness. She played honestly, but she didn't play to destroy him, because there is a difference between letting someone win and playing the kind of game that gives a person room to breathe. The second game, she didn't let him win. She played straight, and he lost. And he studied the board after with the expression of someone cataloging exactly where things had gone wrong. "You didn't let me win that time," he said. "You're old enough not to need it," she said. He considered this. "Papa says that too," he said. "About things." A pause. "He doesn't say it the same way." She started resetting the board. "One more?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. And something in his shoulders, something she hadn't even noticed was held tight until it released, came down by a fraction of an inch. It was not a breakthrough. It was not a healing. It was a boy and a woman playing checkers on a Tuesday afternoon, and it meant something and nothing all at once, the way most true things do. She found the garden at the end of the second week. Not the kitchen garden, which she'd been working on steadily each morning. That was coming back, slowly. The tomatoes revived in a new row of late-season greens she'd planted from seeds she'd brought in her bag. The kind of thing you bring when you've lived enough of your life to know you always plant something wherever you land. The other garden. The one behind the east wall of the house, through a wooden gate that was overgrown with climbing vines and latched with a rusted latch she had to force with her palm before it gave. She understood immediately what it had been. The beds were laid out with care, the kind of care that speaks of real pleasure in the doing, not the functional geometry of a kitchen garden, but something more deliberately beautiful, with curved edges and a central path, and what had once been a climbing rose along the south wall, now gone to wild canes that needed cutting back before they broke the trellis entirely. She stood in the middle of it for a while. The wind moved through the canes and made a small, dry sound. She didn't touch anything that day. She just looked at it, and then she went back through the gate and latched it behind her. That evening at supper, she said casually, to no one in particular, "The rose in the east garden's going to take the trellis down if it isn't cut back before fall." Wyatt looked up from his plate. "That garden's not used," he said. "The rose doesn't know that," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The children were quiet in the particular way children go quiet when they sense something significant happening in the air around them. "Leave it alone," he said. "All right," she said. She went back to her supper. But she had planted the word, the way she planted everything, quietly, without ceremony, trusting time to do what time does. And that was the end of the second week, and the end of the beginning, and the beginning of everything that was about to become much harder. The rose canes were still there when she woke the next morning. She could see the east wall from her bedroom window if she stood at the right angle, and she had taken to not standing at that angle, which was its own kind of discipline. She made her bed, laced her boots, and went to the kitchen to start the stove before anyone else in the house was moving. This was her time, the 40 minutes between the first light and the moment the house began to creak with the sounds of people waking. She used it the same way every day: fire in the stove, water on to heat, whatever prep work could be done quietly and alone. She was not a person who needed much, but she needed this: the stillness, the sense that the day had a shape she'd had some hand in forming before it formed itself around her. The third week began with a problem she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Aldridge arrived on Monday morning for her cleaning day and made her displeasure about the kitchen garden immediately apparent. Not through anything she said directly, but through the particular quality of her silence when she walked past the new row of greens and the staked tomatoes and the cleared beds. It was a silence with architecture to it, rooms in it. Evelyn waited until mid-morning when they were both working in the house. Evelyn scrubbing the pantry shelves, Mrs. Aldridge polishing the hallway floor, before she said anything. "The garden was mostly weeds when I arrived," Evelyn said. "Margaret left suddenly," Mrs. Aldridge said. "There wasn't time to maintain everything." "Of course," Evelyn said. There was a pause. "Margaret had her ways," Mrs. Aldridge said. "She knew how Mr. Blackthorne liked things done." "I expect she did," Evelyn said. Another pause, longer this time. "He's particular," Mrs. Aldridge said, "about the house, about how things are kept." "He seems like a man with standards," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even, conversational, entirely without edge. Mrs. Aldridge polished in silence for a while. Then, "The east garden is not to be touched. That was always understood." "He told me," Evelyn said. "I haven't touched it." This seemed to satisfy something, or at least conclude something. and they finished the morning without further reference to gardens or standards or Margaret's ways. But Evelyn filed the conversation away with the care she gave to all information, not as a grievance, but as a map. Knowing where the walls are is not the same as intending to walk through them. It's just knowing where you are. By Thursday of that week, she had the pantry reorganized, the kitchen garden properly established, and a routine of meals that the children had stopped approaching with suspicion. Rose had started arriving in the kitchen each morning before breakfast to watch the preparations, sitting on a stool near the work table with her chin in her hands, not always talking, sometimes just watching in the comfortable way a person watches a fire when it's doing what it's supposed to do. Ethan came by a different route. He began asking questions, practical questions, the kind that have a technical correctness to them and therefore require no particular emotional exposure. How long do you cook dried beans? Why does bread rise? What happens if you put salt in too early? She answered each question seriously, without the particular condescension adults often bring to children's curiosity, which is the thing children dislike most about being taught by adults who have forgotten what it was to not know something. She didn't know, during those early weeks, whether any of it was reaching Wyatt. He was rarely home before supper, and supper was the one time each day the four of them were in the same room, and the room had its own silences and territories that she was still learning to navigate. He asked the children about their days, Ethan's lessons, Rose's reading, and they answered in the abbreviated way children answer when the question is a ritual rather than a real inquiry, and he accepted their answers in the abbreviated way adults accept answers when they're asking from a sense of duty rather than actual curiosity. It was a family going through the motions of being a family, and the motions were not nothing. They were better than silence, better than nothing at all, but they fell short of the real thing by a distance that everyone at the table felt and no one named. She didn't try to fix supper. That wasn't her place, and she understood it wasn't her place. She just made sure the food was good and the table was set and the room felt like a room someone cared about, and she let the rest of it be what it was. What she didn't expect was what happened on the Friday at the end of the third week, when Holt came to the kitchen door in the middle of the afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that meant something had gone wrong outside the ordinary range of things going wrong. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "we've got a situation." The situation was a ranch hand named Cole, 22 years old, who had taken a bad fall from a horse while working the eastern fence line and been brought back to the bunkhouse with a gash along his forearm that needed more attention than the bunkhouse could provide. The nearest doctor was in Dalton, 14 miles away, and the injury, while not life-threatening if properly treated, was heading in a direction that warranted concern. "Mr. Blackthorn's still out on the north section," Holt said. "We can't reach him for another hour, maybe more." Evelyn looked at the gash when they brought her to the bunkhouse. It was deep and had been closed, imperfectly, with a strip of cloth that was already showing signs of failure. Cole was sitting on the edge of his bunk with the particular gray pallor of a young man trying hard not to show how much pain he was in. "You've done this before?" Holt asked her. "Yes," she said, which was true. She did not elaborate on the circumstances, which involved 2 winters in a mining camp east of Denver after her husband died, working as a cook and occasional everything else for a crew of 40 men whose nearest medical assistance was a full day's ride. You learned what you needed to learn in circumstances like that, or you watched men suffer for want of it. She cleaned the wound properly, closed it with the needle and thread from her sewing kit. The young man went very still and very pale during this part but did not make a sound, and bound it in clean cloth she asked Holt to provide from the supply room. "Keep it dry," she told Cole. "Don't use that arm for anything heavier than a cup of coffee for 3 days. If it starts running red or hot, someone needs to ride for the doctor immediately. No waiting." Cole looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in the voice of someone who has just had the nature of a situation clearly explained to them. She was back in the kitchen starting supper when Wyatt came in an hour later. He had heard from Holt on the way back in. She could tell by the way he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression that was several things at once. "Holt says you stitched up Cole's arm," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "He says you did it well." "Holt's generous," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You've done that before." "Yes," she said. He didn't ask where or when, which she appreciated. Some questions are offered as courtesy when what's really being communicated is something more like respect, and she understood this one for what it was. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply, without qualification or elaboration, and she found that she respected him for that. "Supper in an hour," she said. He went to wash up. The ranch hand's attitude toward her shifted after Cole's arm. Not dramatically. Ranch hands are not, as a rule, given to dramatic shifts in anything, but in the small, consistent ways that matter more over time than any grand gesture. They stopped treating her with the particular combination of wariness and disregard that working men often extend to a woman they don't know what to make of. She became, instead, simply someone who was there and competent and deserving of basic courtesy. Holt began stopping by the kitchen door on mornings when nothing was particularly wrong, which she understood was his version of social conversation. A man named Pruitt, who had a bad tooth that had been bothering him for weeks, asked her whether she knew anything that might help with the pain while he saved up to ride into Dalton for the dentist. She gave him what she had, clove oil she kept in her medicine bag, and instructions on how to use it, and Pruitt looked at her afterward with the expression of a man who has just had 3 weeks of suffering reduced to something manageable. "You're all right, Mrs. Hartwell," Pruitt said. "Glad to help," she said. These things were not part of her job. They were not in any agreement, stated or implied. But she had lived enough of her life among working people to understand that a community, even a working ranch that would resist being called a community, is held together by exactly these small, unremarked kindnesses, and that the person who offers them without expectation of return is the person around whom the whole structure silently organizes itself. Wyatt noticed, because Wyatt noticed everything that happened on his property. He just noticed it from a distance, which was where he preferred to be in relation to most things. The 4th week brought the first hard rain of the autumn, 3 days of it, steady and cold, the kind that turns the ranch roads to mud and keeps everyone closer together than they'd otherwise choose to be. The children were inside all day, which was its own particular challenge. Ethan, with nowhere to go and his lessons finished by midday, drifted to the library and stayed there, which was the choice she would have expected from him. Rose, who could not sit still for more than 40 minutes without something to do with her hands, became a permanent fixture in the kitchen. On the second rain day, Rose found the jar of dried lavender in the back of the pantry. "What's this for?" she asked, holding it up. "It was probably for something to dry," Evelyn said. "Sachets, maybe, or just the smell of it." Rose opened the jar and smelled it and made a face that was not quite displeasure, more like the face a person makes when something is stronger and stranger than expected. "Mama had some," she said. "In her bureau." Evelyn continued with what she was doing. "Did she use it for anything?" "She kept it with her handkerchiefs," Rose said, "so they'd smell nice." A pause. "All her handkerchiefs smell like that now, still." Evelyn set down the spoon she was holding and turned, but Rose had already moved on. She was carrying the jar to the window and holding it up to the gray rain light, as if checking its contents for something she hadn't found yet. "Can we do something with it?" Rose asked. "What would you like to do?" Rose thought about this with the concentrated seriousness she brought to most things. "Sachets," she said. "Like you said." They spent the afternoon making sachets from scraps of cloth in Evelyn's sewing basket. Rose's stitching was rough and uneven, and she went through 3 failed attempts at a square before she arrived at something that could, generously, be called a pouch. And she was entirely serious and unsentimental about the failures, pulling out the bad stitching with a focused scowl and starting again. Evelyn gave her no particular praise for the attempts, which was what Rose needed. She needed someone who expected her to be capable and waited for the capability to appear. The finished sachets were imperfect, lumpy. One of them had a corner that would never properly close and leaked a little lavender when you squeezed it. Rose looked at her work with the same concentrated assessment she'd given the failed stitching. "They're not pretty," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed, "but they'll smell right." Rose seemed to decide this was sufficient. She carried the sachets upstairs herself, and Evelyn did not follow to see where she put them, because some things are private, and the privacy is the point. That evening at supper, something was different in the room. Not large, not named, but present. Wyatt looked at his daughter across the table with an expression that was not open, exactly. He was not a man who opened easily, but the expression was less closed than usual, as if something had shifted inside by one small degree. He didn't say anything about the afternoon. He didn't know about the afternoon. But Rose sat slightly differently at the table than she usually did, and Ethan had come to supper with a book he'd been reading, and he set it beside his plate instead of leaving it in the library, which meant something too. Evelyn served the soup and said nothing and listened to the rain. It was toward the end of the 4th week that she made the mistake. It wasn't a large mistake. It was the kind of mistake that comes from good intentions moving faster than good judgment, which is a very common kind and not always forgivable for being common. She went through the gate to the east garden. Not to do anything permanent. She told herself this clearly. She was going to look at the rose canes, assess whether the trellis was actually in danger before fall set in completely, and go back out and latch the gate and say nothing to anyone. The garden looked worse than it had before in some ways. A week of rain had weighed down the canes, and one of them had indeed come away from the trellis at the top, bending outward in a long, graceful arc that would, if left another week, either break the trellis or root itself in the ground and begin growing in an entirely new direction. She stood in the wet garden for a while. The rain had stopped that morning, and the soil smelled of cold and damp and the particular mineral sharpness that comes after long rain. The rose canes were thick at their base, old growth, years of it, carefully tended at some point and then left alone all at once. She found she was thinking about the woman who had planted them. She didn't know much about Clara Blackthorne. She had gathered pieces, from the closed door upstairs, from the cracked mug on the shelf, from Rose's handkerchief with the lavender, from the way Wyatt sometimes stood in a room and looked at a particular corner of it with an expression that had nothing to do with the room as it currently was. A woman who made things grow, who kept lavender with her handkerchiefs and baked bread on Sundays, and planted roses in a walled garden with curved beds and a central path. A woman who had been, by all evidence, the actual warmth of this household. Evelyn reached out and took hold of the loose cane. She meant only to assess how far gone the attachment was. She did not mean to tie it back to the trellis with the strip of cloth she had in her apron pocket, left over from Cole's bandaging. But she did. It took about 3 minutes. The cane was pliable enough, the trellis sound enough where it mattered, and the tie was simple and would hold through one more season at minimum. She stepped back and looked at what she'd done, and she felt, with the clarity of someone who knows herself reasonably well, that she had overstepped. She latched the gate behind her and went back to the kitchen. She did not tell anyone. For 3 days, she did not tell anyone. It was Ethan who saw it. He came to her on the Thursday morning with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not his usual careful neutrality, but something more complicated, layered, with a tightness around his eyes that meant he was managing several feelings at once. "Someone went in the east garden," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I did," she said. He was quiet. She let him be quiet. "Papa said to leave it alone," he said. "He did," she said. "So why did you go in?" She considered how to answer this honestly, without turning it into an explanation designed to make herself seem better than the choice warranted. "The rose cane was going to pull the trellis down," she said. "I went in to look at it, and then I tied it back instead of just looking. I shouldn't have done it without asking." Ethan looked at the table. He was thinking something through. "Mama planted that garden," he said. "I know," she said. "Papa doesn't go in there," he said. Not since she died." "I understand," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were his father's eyes. Same color, same particular directness, but with something in them that Wyatt's didn't have or didn't show. Something still unguarded. "It's not going to fall down now?" he asked. "The trellis." "Not this season," she said. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. And then, in a different voice, quieter, "She liked that garden a lot." "It shows," Evelyn said. He went back to his lessons. She went back to the bread she was making. The kitchen was very quiet, and the stove was warm, and the rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the light outside a clean, pale color that filled the windows. She had not fixed the garden. She understood that clearly. She had tied one cane to one trellis, and it meant nothing in any significant sense. But it also meant something, in the small economy of meanings that governed this house, and she would wait and see what that something turned out to be. She didn't have to wait long. That evening, Wyatt did not come to supper on time. The food was ready, and the children were at the table, and 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Rose was beginning to slide sideways in her chair in the particular way of a hungry child, exercising every last reserve of patience, and Evelyn was about to serve without him when she heard the back door. He came into the kitchen with mud on his boots and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled tension of his bad moods, not the deliberate blankness he used for things he didn't want to discuss. Something else. Something that had less of a lid on it. "You went into the East Garden," he said. It was the same words Ethan had used that morning, but they landed differently from Wyatt. They landed with weight. "I did," she said. She did not look away and she did not apologize immediately, because an immediate apology from someone who hasn't actually decided they were wrong is not an apology but a strategy, and she had never been willing to be strategic about this particular kind of thing. "I told you to leave it alone," he said. "You did," she said. "The rose cane was going to take the trellis down. I went to look, and then I tied it back. I should have asked first." "Yes," he said. "You should have." The children were very still at the table. Rose had both hands in her lap. "The trellis was hers," Wyatt said. The word hers had a particular quality, like something kept at a specific temperature for a long time. "The whole garden was hers. I don't want anyone in there fixing things or cleaning things up or—" He stopped. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. She looked at him. I was angry, but underneath the anger there was something raw and complicated, and she recognized it because she had felt it herself, the particular anguish of a person who cannot decide whether preservation or release is the more faithful kind of grief. "I won't go in again," she said. "I give you my word." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he sat down at the table without another word, and she served supper, and no one spoke for a while, and the silence had a different quality than it usually did. Less like absence, more like weather after a storm. Present, cleared. Partway through the meal, Rose said, without preamble, "Evelyn taught me to sew sachets." Wyatt looked at his daughter. "Like Mama's," Rose said. She said it simply, without tactical intent, the way children sometimes name the most important thing in the room as if it is simply a fact to be reported. Something crossed Wyatt's face. Quick, not quite controlled. He looked down at his plate. "That's good, Rosie," he said. It was the most personal thing Evelyn had heard him say to his daughter in 3 weeks, and the fact of it being such a small thing, "That's good, Rosie," made it more rather than less significant. She ate her supper and said nothing. What happened in the 5th week changed the shape of things in ways she had not anticipated and could not have planned for. It started with the women of Clearwater. 3 of them came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in a buggy, unannounced, which Evelyn understood immediately was deliberate, the kind of visit designed to see what a place looks like when it hasn't prepared for company. They were the wives of men with property in the territory. Evelyn didn't know all the names, but she knew the type, the particular combination of social confidence and studied evaluative pleasantness that marks a woman who has spent years being the person who decides things about other people's standing. Their names were Mrs. Carver, Mrs. Dunmore, and a younger woman, perhaps 30, introduced as Miss Alderton, who carried herself with the determined brightness of someone trying not to seem like she is watching everything, while very clearly watching everything. Evelyn opened the door because she happened to be nearest to it. The women looked at her the way the women looked at her. She let them look and then said, "Mr. Blackthorne is out on the property. Would you like to come in and wait?" They came in. She brought them to the formal sitting room, which she had kept in good order, though no one had used it since she'd arrived, and offered coffee. Mrs. Carver, the eldest, accepted. The other 2 followed her lead, because that was how it worked. Evelyn made the coffee and brought it and set it out properly, and then returned to what she had been doing, which was preparing the midday meal. She did not hover. She did not perform. She understood that the performance was what they wanted, in one direction or another. Either the deference that would confirm their expectations or the defiance that would justify them. And she gave them neither. Miss Alderton found her in the kitchen 15 minutes later. "The house is very clean," she said. It was an opener, not a compliment. "It's a well-built house," Evelyn said. "Easy to keep." "Mrs. Blackthorne kept it beautifully," Miss Alderton said. "Of course." "I'm sure she did," Evelyn said. "You've been here— how long now? A month?" "Nearly," Evelyn said. "And how do you find it?" Miss Alderton asked. "The work?" "Fine," Evelyn said. "It's good, honest work." The younger woman was quiet for a moment, studying the kitchen in a way that Evelyn recognized, not looking at the kitchen, really, but looking for evidence of something specific she'd already decided she was looking for. The children seem a little attached, Miss Alderton said carefully. Evelyn looked at her. They're good children. Of course, Miss Alderton said. Of course they are. A slight pause. It's just a household position like this. It can be confusing for children if the lines aren't entirely clear. What the position means, what it doesn't. Evelyn set down the knife she was using for the vegetables and turned to face the younger woman fully. She said, I appreciate you saying so, which was the most truthful thing she could say, because she did appreciate it, in the sense that she appreciated knowing exactly where someone stood. The children are very clear on what I am and what I'm here for. They're not confused. Miss Alderton held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted. The brightness recalibrated. No, she said. I can see they're not. The women left before Wyatt returned. Mrs. Carver, on the way out, paused in the hallway and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was more complex than the one she'd come in with. You've done well with the house, she said, and with the children. A pause. Margaret was good, but the house feels different. I hope in a good way, Evelyn said. Said Mrs. Carver, which was not a yes, but was also not a no. After the buggy had gone, Evelyn stood in the front hallway for a moment. She was aware, with the clarity that comes from being entirely honest with yourself, of what had just happened. Not simply a social call, but an assessment. The kind that gets reported back to people in positions to act on what was observed. She went back to the kitchen and finished the midday meal. She did not tell Wyatt about the visit. Not because she was hiding it, she told him that evening, briefly and without elaboration. 3 women from town had come by. She'd offered them coffee. They'd waited a short while and then left. He nodded and didn't ask further questions, which was his way of indicating that he considered the matter handled, or at least that he trusted her handling of it. What she didn't tell him, because it was not the kind of thing you tell a man about his own household when he hasn't asked, was that she had felt, standing in that hallway after the women left, the specific texture of a battle line being drawn. Quietly, politely, without a word that could be directly answered. She had spent enough of her life on the wrong side of that particular kind of politeness to recognize it from a distance. And she knew, with the steadiness of someone who has simply stopped being surprised by the ways the world arranges itself against certain kinds of women, that it was not going to get easier before it got harder. She started the supper and listened to Rose's footsteps on the floor above. The girl was in her room, probably at the window, the way she liked to watch the last light of the afternoon from the height of the upstairs. And downstairs, the kitchen was warm, and the food was good, and outside the autumn was beginning its slow and impartial work on the land, the way it always did, heedless of everything the people inside the houses were deciding about each other. Victoria Ashford arrived on a Wednesday, which Evelyn would later think was fitting, not a Monday, when a person is still gathering themselves for the week, and not a Friday, when everyone is already looking past what's in front of them. Wednesday was deliberate. Wednesday meant she had planned the timing. The buggy came up the main drive in the late morning, and Evelyn knew before anyone made introductions that this was not a social call in the way Mrs. Carver's visit had been a social call. Mrs. Carver had come to assess. This woman had come to act. She was perhaps 50, with the posture of someone who had never in her adult life been uncertain about whether she belonged in a room. Her clothes were expensive without being showy. A dark traveling coat, good leather gloves, a hat with a single dark feather that had been chosen with care and worn with the casual authority of a woman who does not need to try. She stepped down from the buggy without assistance and stood in the front yard of the Blackthorn house and looked at it the way a person looks at something they feel they have a right to look at. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Georgie came to tell her there was a visitor asking for Mr. Blackthorn. She dried her hands and went to the front door. The woman looked at her for exactly 1 second, enough to take in everything and file it, before her expression settled into something pleasant and entirely unrevealing. "I'm Victoria Ashford," she said, "Clara's sister. I've come to see Wyatt and the children." "Of course," Evelyn said. "Please come in. Mr. Blackthorn's out on the property. I can send someone to let him know you're here." "Please do," Victoria said. She came inside and stood in the hallway and looked at the house in the particular way of someone returning to a place they have strong feelings about, Not nostalgic exactly, more like proprietary. This was her sister's house. The distinction between that and Wyatt's house was one Evelyn suspected Victoria made carefully and consistently in her own mind. Evelyn brought her to the sitting room, offered tea, and went to arrange for Georgie to ride out to find Wyatt. When she returned with the tea tray, Victoria was standing near the mantelpiece, looking at the photograph that sat there, Wyatt and Clara, from some years back, formal and composed in the way of formal photographs, but with something genuine in the way Clara was turned slightly toward her husband. "She looks just as I remember," Evelyn said. It was the true thing to say and also the right thing. Victoria turned from the photograph. "Did you know her?" "No," Evelyn said. "I arrived after." Victoria accepted this. She sat down and accepted her tea and asked where the children were. Rose was at her afternoon reading, Ethan at his lessons. Victoria said she would wait for Wyatt before seeing them, which told Evelyn something about how this woman operated. She preferred to have the full room before she began. Evelyn left her to her tea and went back to the kitchen and thought, with the calm of someone who has learned not to borrow trouble from the future when the present already has enough of its own, that this was going to be a complicated week. She was not wrong. Wyatt arrived back at the house just past midday. Evelyn heard the change in him the moment he walked through the side door. Not the usual end-of-morning tension, the kind that unwound itself over supper, but something different, something with anticipation in it. He went directly to the sitting room, and she heard the door close. She did not listen at the door. She had never been that kind of person, but the house was not large enough to keep all of its sounds to itself. And she heard enough, the rhythm of the conversation more than the content, the particular cadence of two people who have known each other a long time and have, underneath everything pleasant, a significant disagreement they have been working around for longer than is comfortable. The children found out Victoria was there when Rose came downstairs for water and saw the unfamiliar coat hung in the hallway. She stood looking at it for a moment and then looked at Evelyn with an expression Evelyn couldn't entirely decode. "Aunt Victoria's here," Rose said. It was not a question. "She arrived this morning," Evelyn said. Rose looked at the coat again. She did not say anything further, which with Rose, who generally said most of what she was thinking, meant she was saying quite a lot. Ethan came down 10 minutes later, drawn by some instinct, or perhaps by Rose telling him, and he too stood in the hallway briefly before going to find his father. He came back to the kitchen shortly after with the composed expression he wore when he was working hard not to look unsettled. "She's going to stay a few days," he said. "Your father's guest room is ready," Evelyn said. She had been keeping it in order since she arrived, as a matter of habit. "She usually stays in—" He stopped. She waited. "She used to stay in Mama's room," he said. "When she visited, they'd talk half the night." He looked at the wall. "I used to hear them." Evelyn set a plate of biscuits on the table. "Sit down," she said. "These came out better than yesterday's." He sat down. He ate 2 biscuits without comment, which was, for Ethan, an expression of considerable feeling. But Victoria joined them for supper. The table had a different quality with her at it. Not bad, not hostile, but altered in the way of a room in which the pressure has shifted. She was well-mannered and attentive to the children, and her attention to them was genuine. Evelyn could see that. She asked Rose about her reading and listened to the answer. She asked Ethan about the section of fence repair he'd been helping Holt plan, because she was the kind of woman who knew what an 11-year-old boy on a working ranch cared about, and she asked it as a real question. She spoke to Evelyn twice during supper, once to compliment the stew, which she did with the grace of someone who could have chosen not to, and once to ask how long she'd been in the position. Both times she was perfectly civil. Perfectly civil was, in Evelyn's experience, one of the more dangerous modes a person could operate in. It left nothing to object to and gave nothing away. Wyatt was quieter than usual during the meal. He ate and answered when spoken to and watched his sister-in-law with the children with an expression that was fond, genuinely, and also something complicated underneath the fondness. Gratitude and guilt, and the particular burden of a man who knows he has not managed something as well as another person would have. After supper, when the children had gone up and Evelyn was clearing the table, she heard Victoria in the sitting room begin the conversation she had come for. She did not hear it all. She heard enough. Victoria's voice, measured. "Wyatt, I'm not saying she isn't capable. I can see she runs the house well, but there's a difference between capable and appropriate." Wyatt, lower. Something about Evelyn managing fine, about the children responding well. Victoria again. That's exactly what I mean. The children are responding to her, Rose especially, and I wonder if you've thought about what that means, what it looks like. What people are going to say about a widow you've brought into this house who is… The sitting room door was not quite closed. Evelyn finished clearing the table and went to the kitchen and began washing the dishes, and she ran the water a little louder than strictly necessary because she had her own dignity to maintain, and eavesdropping on a conversation about herself was not something she was going to do with any deliberateness. But she knew the shape of it. She had known the shape of it since Victoria stepped down from that buggy tub. The next 2 days were a kind of slow pressure. Victoria was never rude. She was never anything that could be named and answered directly, which is the sophisticated version of cruelty, the kind that leaves the person on the receiving end of it unable to say with certainty that anything has actually been done to them. She redirected the children away from the kitchen with suggestions: a walk before noon, a particular book she'd brought for Ethan, an afternoon project she wanted to do with Rose involving the pressed flowers Clara had kept in a box in her old bureau. These were not bad suggestions. They were good suggestions, kind even, and the children went along with them because Victoria was their mother's sister, and she loved them, and they knew it. But Evelyn watched Rose glance toward the kitchen doorway when they were leaving for the walk, the way a child looks toward a thing she's not sure she's allowed to want, and she felt the pressure of it with a specificity she recognized. She had been redirected before, gently, thoroughly, in ways that left no handhold for objection. She went on with her work. Holt noticed, because Holt noticed most things that happened on the property, with the low-level vigilance of a man who has spent 20 years keeping a complicated operation running. He stopped by the kitchen on the second morning of Victoria's visit with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Why?" He looked at his hat. "Just checking." "Holt," she said. He looked up. "If you've got something to say it." He was quiet for a moment. "Victoria Ashford is a good woman," he said. "She loved Clara. She loves those kids." A pause. "She also thinks she knows what's best for this family, in a way that doesn't always leave room for what the family might actually need." Evelyn absorbed this. "That's a careful way to put it," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said. "Has she done this before?" Evelyn asked. "Come out and reorganize things?" Holt looked at the wall. "There was a woman 2 years ago. Came to help with the children after Clara died. Good with them, real good." He paused. "She was gone inside a month." Evelyn held this information and said nothing. "I'm not saying anything's going to happen," Holt said. "I'm just saying you've done right by this place. By those kids." He put his hat back on. "Wanted you to know someone noticed." He went back to the yard. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and looked at the stove for a moment, and then she went back to making bread because the bread needed making, regardless of everything else. On the third day, Victoria made her move. She made it through Wyatt, which was the only way it could have worked, because Wyatt was the only person in that house with the authority to act on it. Evelyn wasn't present for the conversation. She learned of its content afterward, in stages, the way you learn of a thing that has been decided about you in a room you weren't invited into. The first stage was Wyatt's face at supper that evening, more closed than usual, carrying something he hadn't resolved. He ate carefully, spoke to the children in his usual way, and did not look at Evelyn more than was necessary. She noticed all of this and catalogued it, and said nothing. The second stage was Victoria at the breakfast table the next morning, with the particular quality of a woman who has won something and is being gracious about it, which is its own kind of statement. The third stage was Wyatt coming to the kitchen on Friday morning, when Evelyn was alone, and standing in the doorway with the expression she had seen once before, the expression from the East Garden conversation, but heavier now, carrying more. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I need to talk to you." She set down what she was doing. She turned to face him. She had learned that the most important thing, in moments like this, was to stay entirely still and let the thing come. He crossed his arms, uncrossed them. He was not comfortable with what he was about to say. She registered this as information rather than comfort. "Victoria has some concerns," he said, "about the arrangement here." She waited. "She feels, and I think she's not wrong, That the children have become... He stopped. Started again. That the lines have gotten unclear about what your role here is, what it isn't. Evelyn looked at him steadily. And what does she think my role should be? She asked. A household manager, he said, which is what you were hired as. Which is what I am, she said. She thinks it's become more than that, he said, with the children. And she thinks... He stopped again, and she could see him choosing words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. She thinks it's not appropriate, given the situation, given who the children are and what they've been through, and given who I am, Evelyn said. He didn't disagree with this, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing he could have done. She looked at him for a long moment. She felt with precision what was happening. Not surprised, because she had seen it taking shape for 3 days. But something else. Something quieter and more durable than surprise. The particular tiredness of a woman who has been assessed and found wanting by people who did not look at her closely enough to see what they were actually looking at. What are you asking me to do? She said. He looked at the floor briefly. She feels it would be better, cleaner, if you found another position, somewhere the situation isn't as complicated. You're asking me to leave, she said. He looked up. I'm asking you to consider it. She looked at him for another long moment. She thought about Cole's arm, and the checkers games, and the bread Rose had pressed with her small hands, and the lavender sachets that were imperfect and would smell right. She thought about the trellis in the East Garden, and the biscuits and 30 mornings before anyone else was awake, stoking a fire in a kitchen that had been cold for too long. She thought about all of it, and then she let it settle. The way you let sediment settle before you can see to the bottom of a thing. All right, she said. He blinked. He had expected, she thought, more resistance, a defense, an appeal. You'll go? He said. I'll go, she said. Not because I agree with what you're telling me. I don't. But I'm not going to fight for a place where the owner of it has decided I don't belong. She paused. I'll need a few days to prepare some things. He nodded. He looked, she thought, like a man who has done something he is not sure he should have done and does not yet know how to sit with the uncertainty. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, thank you. For what you've done here. It's been fine, she said. I'll have supper ready at the usual time. He left the kitchen. She stood alone for a moment in the room where she had spent the last month building something she now had to leave, and then she turned back to the stove and made breakfast, because the children needed to eat regardless. And that was still, for now, her job. She did not tell the children immediately. She needed to think through what needed to be done before she left, and she needed to do it without the weight of their knowledge pressing on her while she worked. There was more than she'd realized when she began making the list. Not possessions, she had almost none of those, but information, things that existed only in her head that needed to exist somewhere else before she was gone. She spent Friday afternoon writing, at the kitchen table, in her careful, plain handwriting. Not a letter, exactly, more like notes. The kitchen larder and what needed restocking by what date. The children's food preferences in detail, more detail than she'd shared with Wyatt. Cole's arm, and when the bandaging should be changed, and what to watch for. The kitchen garden, and what was coming up, and what it would need. The loose board on the third step from the top of the stairs that caught on Rose's nightgown hem when she came down in the dark. The particular way the stove's left burner ran hot and needed watching. It was a strange thing to write. It felt like disassembling something she'd built carefully, piece by piece, and laying all the pieces out so that someone else could find them. She worked until supper, and then put the notes away and made the meal and served it, and sat through the evening the way she sat through every evening, with attention and without complaint. Victoria was present at supper, and she was, if anything, slightly gentler than usual. The gentleness of someone who has gotten what they wanted and can afford generosity now. Evelyn accepted it without acknowledgement. It was Ethan who saw it first. He was his father's son in that way. The noticing, the watching. He looked at her across the table on Friday evening with the expression he got when he was working something out, and she knew he would come to her before morning with the question. He came Saturday, before breakfast. He found her in the kitchen at her early hour, the house still quiet, the stove already going. "You're leaving," he said from the doorway. She turned. He was in his clothes already. He had dressed to come down, which meant he'd been awake for a while. Yes, she said. He stood in the doorway. He was 11 years old, and he had the face of a boy who has already learned more than he should have had to about the way things end. Because of Aunt Victoria, he said. Because your father has made a decision about what's best for the household, she said. That's his right. That's not an answer, Ethan said. She looked at him. He was right. It wasn't. Yes, she said. Victoria is part of it. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb this with the same concentrated seriousness he brought to the checkers board when he was figuring out where the game had gone wrong. She did this before, he said, with Mrs. Connolly, the woman who came after Mama died. Evelyn had not known the woman's name, now she did. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. This is not something you should carry, she said. This is grown people making grown decisions. It's not your weight. It feels like my weight, he said. I know, she said. That's what makes you a good person. But it isn't. He looked at the stove. He looked at his hands. He was fighting something. She could see the fight in the set of his jaw, his father's jaw. When? He asked. A few more days, she said. I have things to finish first. He nodded. He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment, in the early dark of the morning, and she let him stand there because sometimes that's all a person needs, to stand in the space of a thing before it changes. Then he went back upstairs, and she went back to the stove. The hardest part was Rose. She had known it would be Rose. Ethan had his walls, his coping mechanisms, his chess game approach to difficulty. Rose had none of that. Rose had her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness, and a heart that had not yet learned to protect itself by going indirect. She told Rose on Sunday morning, which she had deliberated about and decided was better than Rose finding out from someone else or from observing the packing. She told her in the kitchen, at the work table, where most of the real things between them had happened. Rose went very still when she heard it. She looked at Evelyn with an expression that Evelyn had to work to hold steady against, because it was the expression of a child who has been here before. This exact room, this exact quality of news, this exact feeling of something being removed that had only just been found. Why? Rose said. Not with anger, with the flat, exhausted tone of genuine incomprehension. It's complicated, Evelyn said. Grown-up things are sometimes complicated. That's what Papa says when he doesn't want to explain something, Rose said. He's right that it's complicated, Evelyn said. And I'm not going to tell you a simple version of it that isn't true. Some things just don't work out the way we'd like. You didn't do anything wrong, Rose said. No, Evelyn said. I don't think I did. Then why? Because being right isn't always enough, Evelyn said. She said it gently, because it was a hard, true thing, and hard, true things need to be said gently or they just wound. Sometimes a situation is bigger than whether someone's right or wrong, and when that happens, the best thing a person can do is leave with their head up. Rose looked at the table. Her hands were in her lap. I don't want you to go, she said. I know, Evelyn said. Is that enough? Rose asked. That I don't want you to? Evelyn looked at this child, 8 years old, bare feet, even now in the autumn cold of the morning, a lavender sachet she wore tucked into her pocket when she remembered, and she felt the weight of the question with every part of herself. It matters more than you know, she said. But no, it's not enough. Not this time. Rose said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, Mama left and didn't come back. The kitchen was absolutely still. Evelyn leaned forward and took Rose's hands in her own. She held them firmly, the way you hold something to keep it from shaking. That was different, she said. Your mama didn't choose to go, and me leaving, this isn't the same kind of gone. You understand? Rose looked at her. I'll be in Dalton, Evelyn said. That's 14 miles. That's not the end of the world. It's far, Rose said. It is, Evelyn agreed, but it's not the same kind of far. She held the girl's hands until some of the tension went out of them. Then she released them and sat back and said, Come help me with breakfast. I'm teaching you how to make the good biscuits before I go, the ones Holt thinks are magic. Rose wiped her face with the back of her hand, a fierce, unsentimental gesture. They're not magic, she said. You just watch the butter. That's the secret, Evelyn said, and now you know it. They made the biscuits together, and they were imperfect, as the first good things usually are. Wyatt saw none of this. Wyatt had retreated into the ranch, into the work, into the constant motion that was his preferred method of not sitting with things he wasn't sure what to do with. He was out earlier each morning and later each evening, and the distance between himself and the house had a deliberateness to it she recognized. Not avoidance exactly, more like a man giving himself time to settle on the rightness of a decision he had already made. Victoria, to her credit, did not gloat. She was present and warm with the children, and she kept her conversations with Evelyn brief and civil, and the civility was real in its way. She had gotten what she wanted, and she bore no personal malice that Evelyn could detect. That, in some ways, was the most frustrating part. A person you can dislike is easier to be clear-eyed about. On Monday evening, 2 days before she intended to leave, Evelyn asked Georgie to bring around the wagon schedule. She would need transport to Dalton on Wednesday, and she wanted to arrange it quietly, without making it an event. Georgie looked at her with his 17-year-old face, which was trying hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "You're really going?" he said. "Wednesday," she said. "Early." He turned his hat in his hands. "That's—" He stopped. "It's all right, Georgie," she said. "It's not," he said, with the bluntness of someone young enough to still say the true thing. Then he seemed to catch himself. "Sorry, ma'am." "Don't apologize," she said. "Just arrange the wagon." He did. She spent Monday evening finishing her notes and adding the last things she'd noticed. The kitchen garden would need mulching before the first freeze, which was probably 3 weeks out. The late greens she'd planted were already coming up, and Rose knew where they were. She wrote the bread recipe in full, with the proportion of salt that made it right, the temperature the water needed to be, the way to know the dough was ready by the feel of it rather than the clock. She folded the notes and left them on the kitchen work table. She went to bed at her usual time and lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house settle around her in the dark. The familiar sounds of it, the third step, the window in the upstairs hall that let in the wind when it came from the north, the low creak of the barn that had always been there. A month. She had been in this house 1 month, and it had asked everything of her that a house could ask, and she had given it, and now she was leaving it in better shape than she'd found it, which was what she had always done, and what she would keep doing in whatever came next. She did not let herself think past that. She had learned, in the long discipline of her life, that thinking past the thing you can control is the surest way to be undone by the thing you can't. Tuesday was her last full day. She spent it in motion, final preparations in the kitchen, the garden, a last check of everything she had established, and would be leaving in others' hands. It was late in the afternoon when she heard the horse come hard up the drive, and then Holt's voice outside, and then the change in the house that comes when something has gone wrong on the property. She went to the back door. Holt was dismounting with the urgency of a man who has covered ground fast. "Fire," he said when he saw her. "Section of the south barn. We've got it contained, but Wyatt got his arm. It's not bad, but it needs—" She was already moving. He had a burn along the inside of his left forearm. Not deep, not the worst kind, but raw and already blistering in 2 places, and he had wrapped it himself in a piece of cloth that was inadequate for the job. He was sitting on the fence rail near the south barn when she got there, directing 2 men on the last of the fire suppression with his good arm, his jaw tight. He looked at her when she came through the gate. "I don't need—" he started. "Give me your arm," she said. He gave her his arm. She worked with the kit she'd brought, cleaning and assessing and doing what needed doing, and he held still with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that objecting would cost him more than compliance. The burn was manageable. He would feel it for days, and the 2 blisters would need watching, but nothing was permanently damaged. She bandaged it properly and straightened up. He looked at his arm, then at her. "Thank you," he said. The same words he'd said after Cole's arm, but different now, carrying different weight, freighted with everything that had happened in the weeks between that first occasion and this one. She was leaving tomorrow. They both knew it. The burn on his arm and her steady hands and the bandage she'd wound with care. All of it happening inside the last 24 hours of her time here, and neither of them named this fact. "Keep it dry," she said. "Don't use that arm for anything that strains it for at least 5 days. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was the most unguarded she had seen it. something behind the usual control, something that was close to the surface and being held back with a concentration she recognized as costly. He said, with the flatness of a man saying a hard thing plainly because he doesn't know another way, "You shouldn't be the one leaving." She held his gaze. "That's not your call to make," she said, "or mine." He looked away. He looked at the barn, the men working, the smoke thinning against the late afternoon sky. "No," he said, "I know it isn't." She picked up her kit. She walked back through the gate and across the yard and into the kitchen, and she made supper for the last time, and she made it well, because that was what she did. Wyatt came to the table that evening with his arm bandaged and his face carrying the specific exhaustion of a difficult afternoon layered over the complicated weight of an unresolved thing. The children ate. Victoria spoke about a letter she'd received from a friend in Clearwater. The stove was warm, the food was good, and Evelyn sat at the edge of the meal she had cooked and thought, "This is the last one." And then she ate her supper and listened to the sounds of the house and let the evening be what it was. She would leave in the morning, clean, quiet, with her head up the way she'd told Rose. She had never in her life left a place worse than she'd found it. She wasn't going to start now. She was gone before anyone else in the house was awake. That was intentional. She had said her goodbyes the evening before, to Rose, who had held on longer than either of them planned, and then let go with the quick, fierce dignity of a child who has decided to be brave about something that does not feel brave. To Ethan, who shook her hand with a formality that was entirely his own, and then said, very quietly, that the biscuit recipe was in a good spot, and he'd make sure Rose didn't lose the paper. She had not said a formal goodbye to Wyatt, because there was nothing left between them that a goodbye could adequately cover, and she did not have the energy to perform adequacy. She had her bag. The same leather bag she'd arrived with, shaped the same way, no heavier than before. She had not accumulated things. She never did. Georgie was waiting with the wagon at the side of the house in the gray pre-dawn, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, his face arranged in the expression of a young man trying to seem as though this is an ordinary Wednesday morning. He took her bag and put it in the back without being asked, and they rode the first mile in silence. "You've got somewhere to go?" he asked finally. "In Dalton?" "A boarding house, I know," she said, "and I'll find work." "You'll find it fast," he said. "Way you work." She looked at the road. The land was flat and pale in the early light, the grass gone to its autumn color, the sky above the eastern hills just beginning to show the first gray-pink edge of the day. It was a cold morning, clear, the kind of cold that feels like a beginning rather than an ending if you're in the right frame of mind for it. She was working on being in the right frame of mind for it. "Georgie," she said, "Ma'am." "You've been a good help this past month," she said. "You're a reliable person. Don't let anyone treat you otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. "My ma says something like that," he said. "Your ma's right," she said. They rode the rest of the way to the Dalton Junction in the ordinary silence of two people who have said the necessary things and have nothing left that needs saying. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Fenn, who was 63 years old, had operated her establishment for over 20 years, and had the unsentimental efficiency of someone who has seen every variety of human circumstance come through her front door and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She gave Evelyn a room on the second floor overlooking the side street, clean, small, with a window that let in reasonable light, and charged her a fair weekly rate and asked no questions beyond the practical ones. Evelyn unpacked her bag, which took about 4 minutes. She hung her second dress on the hook behind the door. She set her medicine kit on the dresser. She put the small folding mirror she'd carried since her first marriage on the windowsill because the light was good there. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. It was a perfectly adequate room. She had lived in worse and lived in better, and had long since stopped measuring her circumstances by comparison to other circumstances. This room was where she was now. The question was what came next. She had enough saved for 6 weeks, if she was careful. She had skills that translated reliably into work. Cooking, mending, nursing in the practical sense of the word. The kind of broad competence that comes from having needed to be competent for a long time. Dalton was a working town. There would be something. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour of sitting. Then she went downstairs and asked Mrs. Fenn if she knew of anyone who needed help, and by the following morning she had an arrangement with the owner of the Dalton Hotel, 2 meals a day for the kitchen, 6 days a week, starting Thursday. It was good work. Hard work, feeding a hotel's worth of guests morning and noon. The kitchen was crowded and loud, and demanded a different kind of attention than the Blackthorn kitchen. Less craft, more volume. The constant low-grade problem-solving of high-quantity cooking with ingredients that weren't always what you'd hoped for. She was good at it. She was good at most things she decided to do, not because she was exceptional in any singular way, but because she applied herself to whatever was in front of her with a consistency that most people found difficult to sustain past the first difficulty. She did not think about the ranch more than she could help, which was less than she would have liked and more than was comfortable. She thought about Rose's biscuits and whether anyone was watching the late-season greens in the kitchen garden. She thought about Ethan's checkers game and whether it had improved. She thought about these things, and then she put them away and went back to whatever needed doing, because the thinking didn't change anything, and the work still needed doing. What she did not think about, or tried not to, was Wyatt Blackthorn. 9 days after she left the ranch, Holt came to the Dalton Hotel. She was in the middle of the noon service when Mrs. Fenn's kitchen girl found her and said there was a man at the front asking for her. She finished what she was doing. You don't leave a pot at a critical point for anyone. And then dried her hands and went out. Holt was standing near the hotel entrance with his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who has ridden a significant distance with a specific purpose and is now reconsidering the purpose now that he's arrived. "Holt," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell." He looked at her with the same quiet assessment he always had, measuring, straightforward. "You look all right." "I'm fine," she said. "What's happened?" He turned his hat once. "A few things," he said. "You want to sit somewhere?" They found a corner of the hotel's small front room, away from the main traffic of it. He sat across from her with the posture of a man delivering a report, back straight, words chosen. "Rose hasn't been eating right," he said. "Not sick, just not eating. Picks at things." He paused. "Ethan goes to the kitchen after supper and just stands in it. Doesn't do anything, just stands there." She absorbed this. "The notes you left," Holt said. "Wyatt found them, on the work table. Read them all the way through." He paused. "Twice, I think. From what I heard." She didn't ask from whom he'd heard. The ranch had its own intelligence network, as all small communities do. "Victoria left 4 days ago," Holt said. She looked at him. "Went back to Clearwater," he said. "She and Wyatt had words the night before she left. I don't know what was said. I know it was significant." He turned his hat again. "He's been different since." "Different how?" she said. Holt considered this. "Like a man who's gotten something clear that wasn't clear before," he said, "and doesn't know what to do with the clarity yet." She was quiet for a moment. "Holt," she said, "why are you here? What is it you're actually asking me?" He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "I'm telling you what's happening. What you do with it is your business." She looked at him for a long moment. "He sent you," she said. "No," Holt said. "He doesn't know I'm here." A pause. "He should have come himself, and he knows it. He's working up to something, but Wyatt works up to things in his own time, and that time is going to be later than it should be, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you deserved to know what's going on in that house, before too much time passes." She understood. She understood the loyalty behind it and the risk of it. Holt putting himself between his employer's dignity and the practical reality of what the employer had done. It was not a small thing. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." He nodded. He stood, put his hat back on. He looked at her with the directness she'd respected since the first week. "You made that house a home," he said, "in 30 days. Some people try for years and can't do it." She did not know what to say to this, so she said nothing, which was the right choice. He left. She went back to the kitchen and finished the noon service. She thought about what Holt had said for 3 days. She thought about it in the way she thought about most difficult things. Not continuously, but in the spaces between tasks, when there was a moment of stillness and the mind goes where it wants to go. She was not a woman who waited for things to come to her. She was also not a woman who ran toward things that hadn't fully presented themselves. The line between those two positions was one she had navigated her entire adult life, and she knew its width precisely. She decided to wait one more week. If Wyatt Blackthorne wanted something different than what had happened, he was going to have to find the words for it himself. She was not going to make it easy, not because she was punishing him, but because anything worth having between two people who have started badly needs to be sought for clearly. She had given enough already, in quiet and without being asked. What came next needed to come from him. She cooked her hotel meals and walked to the Mercantile on her afternoon off and wrote a letter, not to anyone at the ranch, but to a woman in Denver she'd worked alongside years ago. A brief note asking after her circumstances, keeping the thread alive. She mended her second dress at the elbow, which had been needing it. She helped Mrs. Fenn with a stuck window latch on the third floor because she happened to know how to unstick window latches, and it was there to be done. She was on her way back from the Mercantile on the afternoon of the 11th day when she saw the Blackthorn horse tied at the post outside Mrs. Fenn's boarding house. She knew the horse, a dark bay with a specific way of holding its left ear. She stopped on the boardwalk and looked at it for a moment, and then she continued walking. Wyatt was in the small front room of the boarding house. Mrs. Fenn, who had absolutely no need to be in the front room at that hour, was also there, doing something unconvincing with a vase of dried flowers near the window, and took herself off with the dignity of a woman pretending she hadn't been curious about the visitor. He was standing when Evelyn came in. He'd taken his hat off. He looked, not the way she'd expected, actually. She had expected either the formal posture of a man delivering a rehearsed statement or the closed-down look of the supper table. He looked like neither of those things. He looked like a man who had ridden 14 miles with something he needed to say and had been sitting with it long enough that it had worn through whatever armor he'd started with. He looked tired. He looked honest. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said. She set down her parcel from the Mercantile and sat down in the chair by the window. She did not invite him to sit, but she did not invite him either, and he took the chair across from her, on the edge of it, the way a man sits when he's not planning to stay long or isn't sure he deserves to be comfortable. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "The way things happened," he said. "The way I handled it. I listened to someone who I trusted, and I let that trust do the thinking I should have been doing myself." He paused. He was not a man practiced in this, the direct naming of his own failures. She could see the effort it was taking, and she respected the effort without rewarding it prematurely. "What you did for this family in the time you were there, what you did for my children. I stood in the kitchen and read those notes you left, and I—" He stopped again. "What did you think?" she asked, not unkindly. He looked at his hands. "I thought, a woman who cares this much about people she was only hired to feed doesn't leave those notes as a statement. She leaves them because she wants the family to be all right even after she's gone." He looked up. "Even after we sent her away." She said nothing. "That's not a person you let walk out the door because your sister-in-law has concerns about propriety," he said. "That's not a person you lose because you were too proud and too stuck in your own grief to see what was actually in front of you." The room was quiet. Through the window, she could see the main street of Dalton going about its midday business, indifferent to what was happening in Mrs. Fenn's front room. "Victoria wasn't entirely wrong," Evelyn said. "About some things." He looked at her. He hadn't expected her to say this. "The children were becoming attached," she said. "That's a real thing, and it needed to be thought about carefully. The question isn't whether she saw something real. The question is what she did with it." He was quiet for a moment. "She did what she's always done," he said. "She protected what she thought was Clara's. The house, the children, the way things were when Clara was alive." He paused. "I let her. Because it was easier to let her than to look at what I'd been doing, what I hadn't been doing." "For the children," she said. "For the children," he said. "Yes. And other things." She looked at him. The morning light from the window was doing him no favors. It showed every line of fatigue on his face, the weeks of hard outdoor work, the more recent wearing quality of something he'd been carrying for longer than that. "Rose isn't eating," he said. "Ethan goes and stands in the kitchen. He doesn't even do anything. He just stands there." She had known this from Holt, but she let him say it, because a man who has come 14 miles to say something needs to say it in his own words. "I know she liked you," he said. "Rose, I know Ethan, in his way. I know you reached him somehow. He's not easy to reach." He looked at the floor. I know I made it very difficult for you while you were there, and you did the work anyway, and that's not something everyone would do. I wasn't doing it for credit, she said. I know that, he said. That's the part that... He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the window for a moment, and then looked back at her. That's the part that showed me what kind of person you are, what I had and what I let go. The words hung between them. She looked at him steadily. She was not unmoved. She had never been good at being unmoved by real things, and this was real. But she was also not going to be swept forward by the momentum of his realization before she had thought clearly about what she wanted. What are you asking me, Mr. Blackthorne? She said. He straightened. He looked her in the eye. I want you to come back, he said. Not? He stopped and started again. Not as my household manager. I'm not offering you the position back. I'm asking you to come back as someone who matters. To this family. To me. He said the last two words with the particular care of a man who knows he is going past the boundary of what is safe to say and is choosing to go anyway. I know that's a large thing to ask. I know I don't have the right to ask it after what I did. I know you might say no, and I would deserve that. She was quiet. I'm asking anyway, he said, because I spent 11 days being exactly as stubborn as I always am, and it got me 11 days of a house with no warmth in it, and a daughter who won't eat, and a son who haunts the kitchen like he's looking for something he can't name. He looked at her. I know what he's looking for, and I know where she is. The front room of Mrs. Fenn's boarding house was a plain, small space. Nothing remarkable about it. She had sat in rooms like this at the turning points of her life before, after her husband died, after the mining camp, after the various other moments when the path she was on ended and she had to decide which direction the next one ran. She was not a romantic exactly. She was something more durable than that, a person who believed in the worth of things built slowly and the catastrophic waste of letting something real be destroyed by pride or fear. He had pride and fear in abundance. So did she. The question was whether they both had enough of the other thing. I have conditions, she said. He went very still, listening. I won't be managed, she said. Not by Victoria. Not by the women from Clearwater. Not by whoever else has opinions about my place in your house. If I come back with a standing that isn't subject to revision every time someone with good breeding and bad information shows up and decides I'm a problem. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. The children, she said. If they become attached to me, that's not a problem to be solved. That's what children do with people who are good to them. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't put distance between myself and them to make other people comfortable. Agreed, he said. And you, she said. He met her eyes. You don't get to be cold and distant and then angry at me when I draw conclusions from that, she said. I understand that grief is not linear, and I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to be honest. With me and with yourself. About what you're feeling and what you want and what you're afraid of. She paused. I've spent a month watching a man who is afraid of feeling things run himself ragged, trying to outwork it. I understand it. I don't accept it as permanent. He was very quiet for a long moment. That's the hardest one, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying it first. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. I can try, he said. I'm not going to promise I'll be good at it. I've spent a long time not being good at it. But I can try. That's all I'm asking, she said. Outside, the bay horse shifted at its post and settled. The midday light moved through the window and crossed the floor between them. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his voice was different than she expected. Not formal, not careful. Just her name, said the way you say something you've been thinking for a while. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it. The way I looked at you when you arrived. The things I assumed. The way I let someone else make a decision I should have made myself. He held her gaze. I saw your worn dress and your old bag, and I decided who you were in about 30 seconds, and I was wrong about nearly everything I decided. Not everything, she said. I am small. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the thing that happens to a face before it remembers how to smile. You're not small, he said. I was wrong about that too. She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the street for a moment, at the ordinary traffic of a working town on a Wednesday afternoon. She thought about the kitchen garden, the late greens coming up in the cold, the loose board on the third step, the east garden and its rows, held by a strip of cloth through one more season. She thought about a little girl with flour on her cuffs, sorting beans with total concentration. A boy who haunts a kitchen looking for something he can't name. She turned around. "I'll need to give the hotel proper notice," she said. 2 days. He stood. 2 days? He said. "I'll be back Friday morning." "Early," she said. "I keep early hours." "I know," he said. "So do I." She walked him to the door. He paused on the threshold and looked at her one more time. Not the assessing look of the first morning, but something different entirely. Something that was, under all the residue of difficulty and pride and grief, close to the thing he'd ridden 14 miles to find. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you've managed to be honest with me for a full month without retreating." He almost smiled. "That's a reasonable timeline," he said. "It is," she said. He put his hat on and went down the steps to his horse, and she watched him go from the doorway, and then she went inside and went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. The light was different at this hour. Afternoon, lower, warmer than the morning light. It caught the small mirror on the windowsill and reflected a narrow bar of brightness across the plain wall. She was not given to extended self-examination as a rule. She was a practical person and she knew it and considered it an asset, but she allowed herself, in the quiet of that ordinary room, to acknowledge what was happening. Not the surface of it, the logistics, the conditions she'd named and that he'd agreed to, but underneath that, what it would mean to go back. What she was risking. What she already knew, somewhere below the level of careful thinking, about what this family was to her and what it might become. She had not intended to care. She had come to do a job and she had done it, and the caring had simply happened the way water finds the lowest point. Not by intention, by nature. She had lost things before. Her husband. The mining camp. A dozen positions in the practical geography of a woman's life who has had to start again more times than she would have chosen. She knew how to leave and she knew how to stay, and she knew the difference in cost between the two, and she was not under any illusion that going back would be simple. But she also knew this. The thing Wyatt Blackthorne had come here to say was a thing that cost him genuinely. She had watched enough people in enough rooms to know the difference between a man performing an apology and a man actually making one. He had made one. Imperfectly, haltingly, with the rough edges of a man who doesn't do it often enough to be smooth at it. And that roughness was the proof. She was going back. Not because he'd asked, not because the children needed her, though they did. Not even because the house needed her, though it did. She was going back because she had, in 30 days, built something real in that household. And she was not the kind of woman who walked away from real things simply because real things are hard. She gave the hotel her notice that evening. The owner, a practical man named Gall, who had run the establishment for 15 years without much sentiment, accepted it with the brevity of a man who recognized good help when he had it, and also knew you couldn't keep it against its will. "Good worker," he said. "Doors open if things don't work out." "Thank you," she said. "I'll remember that." She did not think she would need to remember it, but she had learned not to close doors unnecessarily. Life had a way of asking you to walk back through them. She packed her bag on Thursday evening, which took 5 minutes. She had been packed, in a sense, since she arrived. It was a quality of her life that she carried nothing she couldn't carry, went nowhere she couldn't leave from. It was a useful quality, and also, she recognized in the honest way she had with herself, a lonely one. The habit of lightness that comes from having been left often enough to stop accumulating things you'd have to leave behind. This time, she packed the small mirror last, which meant she stood at the window without it for a moment and looked at the plain view of the side street and the gray autumn sky above the rooftops and thought, all right, here we go again. And then she wrapped the mirror carefully and put it in the bag. She told Mrs. Fenn she was leaving Friday morning. Mrs. Fenn, who had drawn her own conclusions about the visit from the Blackthorne man, accepted this with the composure of a woman who has seen this particular kind of story before and has opinions about it she is keeping to herself. "You know your own mind," Mrs. Fenn said. "Most of the time," Evelyn said. "That's more than most," Mrs. Fenn said. Rates paid through Friday, so you've got breakfast before you go. She had breakfast before she went. She had learned long ago not to refuse practical kindness when it was offered cleanly. Wyatt arrived at the boarding house on Friday at 7:30 in the morning. He had brought the good wagon, not the work wagon. She noticed this and understood it. He helped her with her bag and did not make unnecessary conversation, which she appreciated. She was not in the mood for performance. She was in the mood for the road and the cold air and the motion of getting back to the work. They drove in silence for the first mile, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her. Silences between people who are still figuring each other out are usually uncomfortable. This one had a different quality. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of a shared understanding that they didn't need to fill the space. It was Wyatt who spoke first. "The late greens came up," he said. She looked at him. "In the kitchen garden," he said. "Row you planted before you left. Ethan told me. He checked it yesterday morning." "The soil's good there," she said. "They'll be ready in 3 weeks if the freeze holds off." He nodded. A mile further, Rose found the biscuit recipe. She already knew the main part of it, Evelyn said. She just needed the proportions written down. "She tried to make them yesterday," he said. "Thursday morning." "How were they?" He was quiet for a moment. "A little flat," he said. "She didn't let the butter get cold enough." "She'll figure it out," Evelyn said. "She made Ethan eat 3 of them anyway," he said. "He said they were fine. I think he was lying." "That's what brothers are for," she said. He looked at her briefly, and what was on his face was not quite the thing from the boarding house, but it was related to it. Warmer, less weighted, something that had room in it. They drove on. The land spread out around them in the clear, cold morning, the autumn colors settling toward their final version of themselves before the winter came and took everything back to plain. It was a hard country and a beautiful one, and she had, over the course of a month, come to feel its particular character, the way you come to feel the character of a person you've lived near, all its moods, its difficult mornings, its rare generosity. She thought about the house as they got closer. The kitchen. The stove. The third step on the stairs. The east garden and its rows, held through one more season by a strip of cloth and the care of a woman who had overstepped and would do it again. She thought about Ethan, standing in the kitchen, looking for something he couldn't name. She thought about the notes she'd left on the work table, and about a man reading them twice in an empty kitchen, and what it must have felt like to hold in your hands the record of someone else's careful attention to things you'd stopped seeing. The blackthorn gate came into view ahead, the iron letters spelling out the name in their thick, deliberate shadow. She looked at it the same way she'd looked at it the first time, with attention, without flinching. "You're going to tell me when you're struggling," she said. "With things. Not just the ranch things. The other things." He was quiet for a beat. "I said I'd try," he said. "Trying means actually saying the words," she said, "not just intending to say them." "I know what trying means," he said, with a mild edge that she recognized. Not anger, just the reflexive resistance of a man who doesn't like being instructed. It would take time. She had time. "All right," she said. They went through the gate. The house was the same house, 3 stories, wide porch, 6 curtained windows on the top floor. Grand and cold and prosperous. All of that exactly the same. But as they pulled around to the side, Rose came out the back door at a speed that suggested she had been watching from the upstairs window for the last 20 minutes, and she came down the steps and across the yard with a directness that didn't leave room for ceremony. She stopped just short of the wagon, looking up at Evelyn with an expression that had not one single layer of pretense in it. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," Evelyn said. Rose considered this for a moment with the gravity of a child assessing whether something is as real as it appears to be. Then she held out her hand with a formality that was pure Ethan, borrowed for the occasion. "I need you to show me the butter thing," she said, "for the biscuits. I got it wrong." Evelyn climbed down from the wagon and took Rose's hand and held it, not shaking it, just holding it for a moment. "We'll do it this morning," she said, "before noon." Rose closed her fingers around Evelyn's hand briefly, and then let go, and turned toward the house with the practical efficiency of a mission accomplished. Evelyn picked up her bag. She looked at the house. She thought about all the things that were still unresolved here, all the ways this could go wrong, all the work that was still ahead. Not the kitchen work, not the garden, but the harder work, the longer work, the work that didn't have a recipe or a clear measurement for when it was done. She went inside. The kitchen was cold. The stove had not been started yet. She set her bag by the door and went to the stove and began building the fire, and the familiar resistance of the morning cold, the weight of the iron door, the smell of ash and new wood, all of it settled around her like something returning to its right shape. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway 5 minutes later. He was dressed, his hair combed, holding a book he'd clearly grabbed as a prop for appearing casual about this. He looked at her with his father's eyes. "Butter," he said, "for the biscuits. Rose has been asking about it since Wednesday." "I know," Evelyn said. "Tell her 20 minutes. He nodded. He looked at the kitchen for a moment. Not the haunted look Holt had described, but something different now, something that had found its footing. He went back upstairs. The fire caught. The stove began to warm. Outside the kitchen window, the autumn morning was doing what autumn mornings do, cold and clear and entirely indifferent to the human things happening inside the houses, which is its own kind of comfort when you think about it. The world going on, the work going on, the fire warming up the room that had been cold. She got out the flour. The biscuits came out right that morning. Not perfect. Rose had overworked the dough slightly in her enthusiasm, which made them a little tougher than ideal, and one batch on the left side of the pan came out darker than the right, because the stove's left burner still ran hot, and Rose had not yet internalized the need to rotate. But the butter had been cold, properly cold, and that made the difference Evelyn had promised it would make. The layers were there, faint but real, and the inside was soft in the way biscuits are supposed to be soft. Rose ate 2 of them standing at the work table before they'd even cooled, which was the most honest review possible. "They're better," she said. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "Not as good as yours." "They will be," Evelyn said. "Give it 6 more tries." Rose considered this timeline with the practical seriousness she brought to all assessments. 6, she said, like it was a number she could work with. Ethan, who had materialized at the kitchen table at some point during the baking with his book open in front of him and clearly not being read, ate 1 biscuit and said it was fine. Which was, from Ethan, considerably warmer than it sounded. Wyatt came through the kitchen on his way out to the property and stopped when he saw the pan. He looked at it. He looked at Rose. He took one without asking and ate it in 2 bites. "Cold butter," he said. "I told you," Rose said. He looked at Evelyn briefly with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. Not the closed look, not the assessing look, but something quieter than both. Something that was still learning how to be shown. Then he put his hat on and went to work. That was the first morning. That was how it started again. Not with ceremony or resolution, not with anything that could be pointed to as a turning point. Just biscuits on a Friday, and a family in a kitchen, and a fire in the stove that someone had thought to build before anyone else was awake. November came in cold and serious, the way November did in that country. Not gradually, but with the blunt announcement of a season that has been patient long enough. The first hard freeze came on a Tuesday, earlier than Evelyn had predicted, and she lost the last of the kitchen garden's late greens to it. She stood in the garden that morning and looked at the blackened leaves and felt the particular frustration of a thing you cannot argue with. The weather doesn't care about your timing, and it never has. She pulled the dead plants and turned the soil and mulched the beds for winter. And when she came inside, her hands were cold enough that it took a full 10 minutes at the stove to get the feeling back into them. Rose found her there, warming her hands. "Did we lose everything?" Rose asked. "The greens," Evelyn said. "The root vegetables are fine. Cold doesn't get them the same way." "I like the greens," Rose said. "We'll plant them again in spring," Evelyn said. "Earlier next time. They need more time than I gave them." Rose accepted this with the equanimity of someone who is beginning to understand that most things worth doing require more time than you initially plan for. The household had found a new rhythm in the weeks since Evelyn's return, and like all real rhythms, it had been arrived at through repetition and small adjustment rather than design. Mornings were hers, the stove, the breakfast, the particular quiet of a house gathering itself for the day. Afternoons were mixed, the children's lessons and whatever the kitchen required and the ongoing project of the household running itself without constant intervention. Evenings were the changed part. Wyatt came home at consistent hours now, not always early, not always before dark, but consistently. She could count on him being at the table, which she had not been able to count on with any certainty in the first month. And at the table he was different, not transformed. Nothing about this man would ever be described as transformed. He was still quiet, still more comfortable with action than with words, still possessed of the particular stubbornness of someone who has operated independently for long enough that collaboration requires conscious effort. But he listened. That was the change she noticed first and held on to. He listened at the table, to Ethan talking about what he'd been reading, to Rose's detailed account of whatever had caught her attention that day, to the ordinary conversation that a family makes out of the small events of ordinary life. He had been present before, technically. He was present now in a different sense, actually there, actually attending. It wasn't always comfortable. Some evenings he said too little. Some evenings when one of the children said something that landed near a particular kind of pain, a memory of Clara, an echo of something she used to say or do, he went distant in a way that was involuntary and visible, and those moments had a stillness to them that Evelyn let be what they were. She didn't fill them. She didn't redirect. She had told him she understood grief was not linear, and she meant it, and meaning it sometimes looked like sitting with the discomfort without flinching. He noticed her noticing. She could see him noticing. "I'm not always going to be good at this," he said to her one evening after the children had gone up. They were at the kitchen table. She'd been mending one of Ethan's shirts, a button replaced, and a small tear at the cuff she'd caught before it became larger. He'd been nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and neither of them had mentioned it. "I know," she said. "Tonight at supper," he said, "when Rose talked about the pressed flowers, Clara used to—" He stopped. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm trying to." He looked at his cup. "She used to press flowers from the East Garden. She'd put them in the books in the library. I still find them sometimes when I'm looking for something else." Evelyn set down the shirt. "Tell me about her," she said. "If you want." He looked up. This was not what he expected. "You don't have to protect me from her," Evelyn said. "She was their mother. She was your wife. She's part of this house whether we talk about her or not." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had come up, November wind with teeth in it. "She was funny," he said. "That surprised people. You'd look at her and think, quiet, composed, all of that. And then she'd say something and it caught you completely off guard." He paused. "She was funnier than me. She knew it. She never made me feel bad about it." Evelyn said nothing. She let him go. "She planted the garden the second year we were here," he said. "I thought it was a lot of work for something that didn't produce anything you could eat. She told me I was missing the point entirely." He looked at his hands. "She was right. I didn't understand it until she was gone and I stood in it and I—" He stopped. "And you understood what she'd built," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. The kitchen was warm. The wind moved past the window with its cold, indifferent sound. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it with the directness of someone who has thought about it long enough to be sure. "She didn't have patience for performance. She liked people who did what they said and said what they meant." He looked at Evelyn. "She would have liked you, and she would have told me I was being an idiot about you in the first 10 minutes. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Evelyn said. "She was wiser than me," he said. "I'm still catching up." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this man with his complicated grief and his considerable stubbornness, and his hands that still showed the burn from the south barn fire, fading now, healed mostly, and she thought, this is not a simple thing. It was never going to be a simple thing. She had not come back expecting simple. She had come back for real. The hard thing happened in December. Victoria came back. She arrived without the advance of a letter, which Evelyn had halfway expected. Victoria was a woman who preferred to control the terms of a situation, and a letter gives the other party time to prepare. She came in the second week of December with a small trunk this time, which meant she intended to stay through Christmas, and she came with the particular quality of a woman who has reconsidered some things but not all of them. Wyatt met her at the door. Evelyn heard their voices in the front hall from the kitchen, and she went on with what she was doing. The first evening was careful. Victoria was courteous to Evelyn in a way that was different from the first visit. Not the pleasant assessment of before, but something with more awareness in it. Awareness of having misjudged, perhaps, or awareness of what the landscape of this household now looked like, and what her position in it was. She was genuinely good with the children. Evelyn had always known this, and it remained true. She brought Ethan a book she'd found in Clearwater that she'd thought he'd like. She'd been right. He was reading it before supper on the first evening. She brought Rose a small box of embroidery threads in colors that Rose would not have chosen for herself, and therefore found fascinating. These were not strategic gifts. They were the gifts of a woman who paid attention to children she loved, and Evelyn respected them for what they were. It was on the third day that the real conversation happened. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden, or what remained of it, the winter beds mulched and sleeping, when she heard Victoria's footsteps on the path. She had known this was coming. A woman like Victoria does not leave a thing unresolved if she can address it. "Mrs. Hartwell," Victoria said. "Mrs. Ashford," Evelyn said. She straightened up from where she'd been checking the mulch on the root beds. Victoria stood on the garden path and looked at Evelyn with an expression that had several things in it, not all of them comfortable for either of them. "I think I owe you an apology," Victoria said. She said it the way people say difficult things when they mean them, not smoothly, with some resistance in it, because the resistance is what proves the sincerity. Evelyn waited. "What I did when I was here before," Victoria said. "The way I spoke to Wyatt about you. I came in with my mind already made up, and I was protecting something, or I thought I was. Clara's place. The children's continuity." She paused. "I didn't stop to look at what I was actually removing." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I'm looking now," Victoria said, "and I can see the difference." She glanced at the house, the winter kitchen garden, the yard. "The difference in the house, in the children, in Wyatt." She looked back at Evelyn. "He's the most present I've seen him since before Clara got sick. I didn't think that was possible." "People surprise you," Evelyn said, "when you give them room." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I didn't give you room," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "I'm sorry for that," Victoria said, genuinely. Evelyn looked at this woman, the dark coat, the good posture, the face of someone who has carried grief of her own, for a sister and for a family she'd watched fracture in slow motion. And she thought about what it costs a person of Victoria's type to say these words, and she acknowledged the cost. I know you love these children," Evelyn said. "That was always clear, and I know you loved Clara. What you did out of that love. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Victoria looked at her with an expression she hadn't shown before, something quieter, stripped of the careful pleasantness. "She would have liked you," Victoria said. "Clara." She paused. "She used to say that the person who keeps a house is the person who keeps the family." She meant it seriously. A beat. "She would have recognized you." It was the second time in as many weeks that someone had told her this. Both times it landed the same way. Not as comfort exactly, but as something more complicated. The acknowledgement of a presence she would never know, in a house that still held the shape of her. "Thank you for saying that," Evelyn said. They stood in the cold garden for a moment longer, two women on a path, the winter light coming flat and pale over the bare beds. "I'm not asking to be friends," Victoria said. "I'm asking to start more honestly than we did." "That's reasonable," Evelyn said. "Good," Victoria said. And she went back inside with the posture of a woman who has done a hard thing and knows it. Evelyn stood in the garden for a moment. The cold was significant now, the kind that gets into the seams of your coat and stays. She looked at the east garden wall beyond the fence line and thought about the rose cane, held by its strip of cloth. Still there, still waiting for spring. She went inside. Christmas came to the Blackthorn house differently than it had in the years since Clara died. Not with any grand gesture or deliberate recreation of old traditions, but with the low-level warmth of a house that had recovered its ability to hold warmth. There was a tree, which had been Ethan's idea, stated with the careful casualness of someone who has been wanting to suggest something for a while and has finally decided to say it. Rose had decorated it with the single-minded intensity she brought to anything she was given responsibility for. And the result was not elegant. She had strong opinions about where the paper stars went that had no relationship to visual balance, but it was real and entirely hers. Evelyn made the Christmas meal. She spent 2 days on it, not because it required 2 days, but but because a meal like this deserved that kind of attention. There was no single dish she was trying to perfect. It was the accumulation of it, the fact of it, the table set with every chair occupied and food enough for everyone, and the particular quality of a winter evening that has been looked forward to. Victoria was there. Holt had been invited, to Evelyn's quiet satisfaction. She had mentioned to Wyatt, on a morning 2 weeks prior, that it seemed an oversight that the man who had held the operation of this ranch together for 20 years spent Christmas with the other hands in the bunkhouse. Wyatt had looked at her for a moment and then said he'd speak to Holt. He'd spoken to Holt. Holt arrived in a clean shirt with the expression of a man who is not sure this is entirely proper but is willing to be convinced. He sat at the table and ate 3 helpings of everything and said, over the pie, that it was the best meal he'd had since his mother was living. Rose, who was sitting next to him, informed him that Evelyn had taught her the crust. Holt told her it showed. Rose sat slightly straighter. Wyatt sat at the head of the table. He had not said anything particularly remarkable during the meal. He was not a man for speeches or toasts or any of that. But at some point near the end of the evening, when the table had been partially cleared and Holt was teaching Ethan a card game of questionable legitimacy, and Victoria and Rose were going through the embroidery threads, Wyatt moved his chair slightly closer to Evelyn's end of the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat nearer. Then he said, quietly enough that it was between them, "This is the first Christmas in 2 years that didn't feel like something I needed to get through." She looked at him. "That's because of you," he said. "I want you to know I know that." "It's because of everyone at this table," she said. "I just kept the stove going." He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "More than that." He looked at the table. Holt's big hands showing Ethan the card trick, Rose's concentrated frown over the threads, Victoria's careful assistance, the remnants of the meal that had taken 2 days and was worth every hour of it. "You walked in here with a bag full of nothing and you put the whole thing back together, piece by piece, without asking for anything in return." "I asked for conditions," she said. "After I'd already broken everything," he said, "and still you came back." He looked at her. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come back." The lamp on the table was low and warm. Outside the windows, the December night was absolute, dark and clear and cold beyond reckoning. "You would have managed," she said. "You're not someone who stops." "Managing isn't the same as living," he said. She thought about this. It was true. She had been managing for 4 years before she came here, surviving, functioning, competent at all the practical requirements of being a person without any of the warmth that makes those requirements worth meeting. She knew the difference between managing and living. She knew it from the inside. "No," she said, "it isn't." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not dramatically, without preamble, just his hand over hers in the straightforward way of a person who has decided to stop being afraid of a thing. His hands were rough, work rough, still carrying the faint scar of the burn. She didn't move. "I would like," he said carefully, as if he is measuring each word, "to ask you something. When you're ready to be asked." She looked at him steadily. "I know what you're going to ask," she said. "I thought you might," he said. "Ask it when the time is right," she said. "Don't hurry it because it's Christmas." He almost smiled. "I wasn't going to ask it tonight," he said. "Good," she said. "I'd like time to think." "Take the time you need," he said. She did not move her hand from under his for a while. The card game continued at the other end of the table, Rose's periodic critique of Holt's teaching methods providing a running commentary that nobody had asked for and everyone was quietly entertained by. This was the evening. This was what she had come back for. Not the declaration, not the moment that would come later when it was time for it, but this. The table and the lamp and the people around it, imperfect and complicated and entirely real chub. Spring found the ranch, with the unhurried certainty that spring always finds things it has been away from. The freeze broke in late February, tentative testing, and then in March the land began its slow return to itself. The gray-brown grass greening at the root, the cottonwoods along the front drive putting out their first small leaves, the air losing the particular iron quality of deep winter cold and becoming something softer, more possible. Evelyn planted the kitchen garden again. Earlier this time, with the lesson of the freeze in mind. She put in the cold, hardy things first and waited for the soil temperature to be right before anything else went in the ground. Rose helped, which meant 2/3 of the row markers were pressed in with more force than was strictly necessary, but they were straight, and Rose had opinions about straight that Evelyn had learned not to argue with. Ethan helped too one afternoon. He had not volunteered exactly. He had wandered out to the garden with his book, and then set the book on the fence rail and said, without preamble, "What needs doing?" She put him to work turning soil in the beds that hadn't been touched since fall, and he did it with the focused economy of a boy who does not waste motion, his father's son in this, as in most things. The East Garden was the last thing. She had not gone back in since her one transgression in the autumn, the night that had set everything in motion. She had kept her word about that. She always kept her word. And the gate had stayed latched, and the rose had stayed on its trellis, the strip of cloth she'd tied doing its job through winter. It was Wyatt who opened the gate. She was in the kitchen garden with Rose one morning in early April when she heard it, the specific sound of that particular latch, the one she had forced with her palm back in October. She looked up. Wyatt was in the opening of the gate, standing still, not going in, just standing in the opening. She told Rose to finish the row they were on and went to him. She stood beside him at the gate, and they both looked in. The garden was coming back the way neglected things come back when the season turns. Slowly, unevenly, the perennials pushing through the dead growth from the year before, the rose canes putting out their first small red buds at the tips. The trellis stood. The strip of cloth had weathered to a lighter color but held its position. "I haven't been in here since the winter she died," he said. She stood beside him and said nothing. "I kept it closed because—" He stopped. "I didn't want to change it. I thought if I kept it exactly the way she left it, it was still hers. Still there." "It's still hers," Evelyn said. "Opening the gate doesn't change that." He looked at the garden for a long time, at the rose beginning to bud, at the curved beds coming back to life in their own unhurried way. "She'd be angry at the state of it," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not just grief, but a tenderness that had survived the grief, the specific love that remembers the real person rather than the ideal of them. Clara who got annoyed at neglected things, Clara who was funnier than people expected, Clara who pressed flowers into library books and planted roses in walled gardens and would have told her husband he was being an idiot in the first 10 minutes. She would, Evelyn agreed. He reached out and unlatched the gate fully, and it swung open. He went in first. She followed. They walked the central path together, not speaking, not needing to speak. The rose was on its trellis, and the beds were waking, and the garden was exactly what it had always been, a place where something had been tended with love, and the love had outlasted the person who planted it, the way love does when it's been put into something real. He stopped at the rose. He looked at the strip of cloth. "You tied this," he said. Not accusatory, just recognizing it. "In October," she said, "before I left." He reached out and touched the cloth lightly. "The trellis would have gone," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet. Then, "She planted this the first spring we were here, before the house was even properly finished. I came out one morning and she was out here with her gardening gloves on, and she looked up and said, 'I know you think this is foolish, Wyatt, but you're wrong.'" A pause. "She was right. I was wrong." "You could tend it," Evelyn said. "The garden. You don't have to close it up anymore." He looked at the rose, at the beds, at the place his wife had made beautiful out of something that didn't produce anything you could eat, and had been right about what that meant. "Will you help me?" he said. She had not expected the question to have that quality. Not the rancher asking the household manager, not even the complicated man asking the complicated woman. Just a person asking another person for help with something they don't know how to do alone. "Yes," she said. They stood in the garden for a while in the April morning, the light coming over the east wall the way it always had, the rose putting out its first cautious color, and the strip of cloth holding, still holding, the thing it had been asked to hold. He asked her in May. Not dramatically. He was not capable of dramatic, and she would not have trusted dramatic from him anyway. He came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet, when Rose was out with Holt learning something about the horses that she had been campaigning for weeks to be taught, and Ethan was in the library with his books. He came in with the specific expression she had come to know as the one that meant he had decided something and was going to say it before he talked himself out of it. She was making bread. The dough was at the stage that needed watching. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what to say for 3 months," he said. "I had a whole speech. I practiced it." He paused. "I've lost most of it." "Say what's left," she said. He looked at her. "Will you stay?" he said. "Permanently. Not the position. Not all of that. Just here. With us. With me." A beat. "I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm not easy. I know the children they're not easy either. I know this place has a history in it that you didn't choose and that I can't change." He stopped. "But I think we do something good together. I think you know that. And I think you've known for a while that He looked at his hands. "That I'm not the same man I was the morning you stepped off that wagon." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had looked at her worn dress and made his conclusions in 30 seconds, and had spent the better part of a year dismantling those conclusions, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Who had asked for honesty and tried to give it, imperfectly, with the friction and resistance of someone who finds it genuinely hard. Who had opened a gate he'd kept closed for 2 years and asked for help with what was on the other side. "I know you're not," she said. "Is that enough?" he asked. And the question had an echo in it. Rose's question, from the autumn, with the same plainness. "Is that enough?" "It's a start," she said. "But yes, it's enough." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands. Flour on them, because of the bread, and he didn't seem to mind. And he held them the way he had at the Christmas table, direct and without performance. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes," she said. He held her hands for a moment longer. Then he said, "The bread." And she turned back to it, and he stayed in the kitchen. He didn't leave. He sat at the table, and they stayed in the same room without speaking, and the bread rose, and outside the May morning went on with its business, bright and indifferent and full of its own abundance. She had come to this house with a leather bag, and nothing much else. No standing, no claim, no certainty of anything beyond a monthly wage, and whatever she could make of the work. What she carried was invisible. The kind of thing you accumulate not through inheritance or luck, but through living, through difficult living, the kind that teaches you things you would not have learned any other way. How to be useful without being diminished. How to build warmth in cold places. How to see what a person needs when they can't name it themselves. How to leave with dignity, and how to come back without surrendering it. People see a worn dress and an old bag, and they make their conclusions. They see a widow with no particular advantages, a woman of a certain age who has survived rather than succeeded, and they decide what she's worth before she's opened her mouth. Here's the thing they miss. Survival is not a lesser category of living. The person who has had to rebuild herself from ordinary materials, no inheritance of wealth or position or protected circumstances, develops a kind of structural integrity that cannot be purchased or performed. She knows exactly what she is and what she is capable of, because she has had to know, because the alternative was not managing at all. Evelyn Hartwell walked into the grandest ranch in the territory with $43 worth of nothing, and she did not need anyone's assessment of her worth to know what she had to offer. She knew. She had always known. She simply waited, as she always did, for the situation to catch up to the knowledge. The children grew. Ethan turned 12 in June and spent most of the summer becoming, visibly and seriously, the next version of himself. A little taller, a little more certain of his own mind, still his father's son in the stubbornness and the noticing, but with something else alongside it now, something that had been allowed to develop in the space that had been made for it. He beat Evelyn at checkers for the first time in August, and was gracious about it in the specific way of someone who has been waiting for this, and prepared a gracious response in advance. Rose made biscuits that were, by September, better than the first ones, not better than Evelyn's. She acknowledged this freely and without distress. She had determined she would surpass them by spring and was planning accordingly. The East Garden bloomed that summer with the uncomplicated commitment of something that has been waiting for permission. The rose came back in full, not a perfect plant, after years of neglect, but alive and clearly intended to stay that way. Wyatt cut the dead canes back himself, with a focus that Evelyn recognized as the focus of someone doing a thing that matters to them privately. She helped him with the beds, with the replanting of what could be replanted. They worked in the garden on Sunday mornings and did not always talk. And the not always talking was its own kind of intimacy, the ease of being in a place together without needing to perform presence. He was honest with her. Not always immediately, not always without the resistance that was simply part of his nature. But he told her when he was struggling. He told her when the grief came back in unexpected ways. A Sunday that felt like a Sunday Clara would have loved. The smell of the rose in July that stopped him in the garden with his hands still in his work gloves. He said the true thing. He had promised to try, and he tried. And the trying was rougher and slower and more real than any version of it that would have made a better story. The drought that had threatened the region through the summer broke in late August with 3 days of rain, steady and soaking, the kind that reaches deep enough to matter. Holt came to the kitchen door on the second morning of it with an expression that was as close to pure relief as his face seemed capable of producing. "Enough to pull the ranch through," he said. "Good," Evelyn said. She handed him coffee. "More than good," he said. He drank the coffee and looked out at the rain coming down on the yard, on the garden, on the land that had been waiting for it. The wedding was in October, small and practical, because they were practical people. Holt was there. Victoria was there. She had written a letter in July that said, among other things, that she hoped to be invited, and she had been. Georgie was there. A few of the ranch hands, cleaned up awkwardly and standing in a row with the combined expression of people who are moved but would strongly prefer not to show it. Rose wore her good dress and a lavender sachet pinned to the collar, which she had made herself and which was, by now, properly stitched. Ethan stood beside his father with the expression of a boy who has decided to be composed about something important and is succeeding, mostly. When it was done, and the small gathering had moved to the dining room for the meal Evelyn had made, she had insisted on making her own wedding meal because she trusted her own cooking more than anyone else's, which was true, and also demonstrated something essential about her character. She stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway. The dining room was full of voices, and the lamplight was warm, and the table was set with all the chairs filled. Rose was already arguing with Georgie about something with the total commitment of a child who is entirely comfortable in her own home. Ethan had found Holt and was asking him something with a focused expression that suggested it was a real question rather than polite conversation. Victoria was talking to two of the ranch hands with the composed ease of a woman who has made peace with where she is. Wyatt came to stand beside her in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He looked at the table, at the people, at what the room had become. She looked at it too. She thought about a morning in August, 4 years ago, when she'd stood in a different room altogether, with $43 and a burial to arrange, and a life she was going to have to rebuild from what she had. She had not known, standing there, what she had. She had found out the way you find out most things worth knowing, slowly, through the work of it, through the long, patient discipline of showing up and doing what needed doing and trusting that the doing was enough. It was enough. It had always been enough. The chair at the head of the table was Wyatt's. The one to his right was hers. Both were pulled in, waiting. She went in to sit down. Some people walk through life looking for the door that leads to something extraordinary, something that will announce itself with a sign and a certainty. They can point to later when they tell the story. They walk past 100 ordinary mornings and plain rooms and worn leather bags, looking for the version of their life that doesn't require the patience of building something from plain materials. What I have come to believe, watching people, living among them, being one of them, is that the extraordinary is almost never where those people are looking. It is in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. It is in the strip of cloth that holds a rose to a trellis through a hard winter. It is in the 6 imperfect biscuits that teach a child that good things require practice and the willingness to fail and try again. It is in the asking and the trying and the long, slow work of being honest with another person past the point where honesty is comfortable. Evelyn Hartwell never needed anyone to tell her she was worth something. She knew what she was worth. She had always known. She just needed a house that was finally ready to know it too.